You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Candy Casey, very good. You're going to do it again, Victoria. Stop smiling. It's not the high school play. Count.
5, 6, 7, 8. 1.
All that work.
Stand on your right foot. Point your left toe. Drop that shoulder.
All that pain.
That's not too hard, is it?
Oh, boy, do I hate show business.
All that
Come with
glitter.
your jokes is what I mean.
Yo, you love show business.
That's right. I love show business.
All that love.
I'll go either way. It's showtime, folks.
All that jazz.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. David Kittredge.
How dare you call someone on my phone that's not gay?
Also joining us in the booth is Ms. Emma Westwood.
I just wish you weren't so generous with your cock.
It's showtime, folks. On this episode, we are talking about Bob Fosse's 1979 film, All That Jazz. It's definitely not autobiographical picture about a choreographer slash director who's working on his previous film about a groundbreaking stand-up comedian while rehearsing his next Broadway sensation. It's definitely not about Fosse facing down his specter of mortality and expressing it the best way he knows how. Of course, we're going to be spoiling this film, so you have been warned. So, Emma, when was the first time you saw All That Jazz, and what did you think?
Going right back, Mike, I think the first time I was around 13 or 14, and I saw the film, just stumbled across it right from the start. I was completely hooked. I think it was because it has an element of surprise from the beginning, and then that incredible opening sequence. And for me, at that time, I was particularly interested in music. So it just happened to hit a lot of familiarity points for me. So something like, for example, George Benson was played a lot in my house. So straight away having something like on Broadway, but even the Bye Bye Love song, we had an Everly Brothers album that was played a lot in the household. Being Australian, Peter Allen was very high on the consciousness at that time. He was in the 70s and 80s. He was kind of a national treasure here. So this was the pre-Hugh Jackman age. So there was a lot of points there that in terms of just, well, I guess you could say the colour and movement that got me. So this is what I find the really interesting thing about this film is that you can watch it on a completely visceral level. And I would call it, that's how it hooked me, on a visceral level. And then you get to know, more about it. I mean, and it's the kind of film that keeps on gifting to you on each viewing. When I'm 13, 14, I'm not interested in, the existential angst of a middle-aged man or anything like that. Get a bit older. I mean, I didn't even understand that thematically at that time, but you get a bit older, then the film says something else to you. And then even in preparing for this episode, and I thank you for this, it kind of gave me an excuse to do an even further deeper dive into Bob Fosse, which the film revealed even more, which is saying something. It's quite unique in that way. I think there's only really a handful of films that work in that way.
How about you, David?
Lord, it had to be on video. It was almost certainly in high school. I remember liking it, but at the time, I remember Leonard Maltin's review of it in his book, which was 2.5 stars, which is basically a C. You know, it's like average. And I remember seeing it and thinking, like, there's a lot in this, in that kind of white suburban milquetoast point of view, which, you know, I really love Leonard Maltin as a person. I think he's a great guy from everything I've heard about him, but he really doesn't, like, his book doesn't like these movies that do anything that's not comfortable. Like, horror films are very low rated. A lot of sci-fi movies are very low rated. Genre movies are very low rated. Rated Taxi Driver 2 stars. He rated Alien 2.5 stars, which I think he changed later. So he rated, like, you know, all that jazz 2.5 stars. And it's like, you know, yeah, it's spectacular, but it's very, I forget what the word was. It was just like, you know, something like narcissistic or navel-gazy or something like that. I was just like, yeah, well, it's another one of these Hollywood creatives, like, just being narcissistic and doing it about their lives. And it took me until, I think, either college or after college, just after college, when I probably saw it on Laserdisc, that I was like, wait a second. There's a lot in this film. There's a lot this film is trying that a lot of other films don't even remotely attempt. And since then, I've just loved it. And certainly when Criterion came out with their stunning Blu-ray, you know, I was already in love with it then. But it's, I think we can honestly say at this point, the way that people view this film, it's legitimately, I believe, one of the best movies ever made. It is on that top 100 list. At least for me, I think it would probably be on the top 100 list for a lot of other people, if not critics, then definitely filmmakers. I think there are movies that critics love, and I think there are movies that filmmakers love. And I think that sometimes there's a crossover between the two. There's a Venn diagram kind of overlap. All that jazz, though, I think like Lawrence of Arabia and like, you know, a number of other movies, probably Hitchcock movies and other movies that kind of push it, very much a filmmaker's movie. Because as a filmmaker, you're watching this and you realize, holy shit, you pulled this off. How on earth did you pull this off? It's just a stunning achievement.
I always think that the age of VHS came much later than it did. Doing research about this movie, I actually picked up a couple magazines that were put out in late 78. I think there was a Films and Filmmaking, American Film, Life magazine, and it was just a wonderful kind of time capsule to go through and see these stories that were there. You know, you talked about Alien. I think it was the Films and Filmmaking magazine said that Alien was the most disappointing film of 1979, which is just absolutely hilarious.
And they trashed The Shining too. Like, you read all that, like, wasn't The Shining up for Razzie Awards?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was.
It's just like, can we just, like, go back in time, or if these people are alive, just, like, put them in a room and be like, you are part of the problem. You were part of the problem. You may still be part of the problem. It's like, you know, yeah, like, you know, everyone who came to David Cronenberg, like, 20 years too late. It's just like, yeah, I wish I'd been seeing these movies when I was in high school instead of reading Leonard Maltin's dumbass reviews. The Brood. The Brood was a bomb. It's like, really, Leonard? Have you seen a fucking horror movie?
Long story short, I thought the video came much later than it did because I just always assumed that it was like more of a mid-80s thing, but it was a lot earlier. I remember seeing this movie on VHS. My folks were watching it, and I was really young. And I think I was probably like, I don't know, 9, 10 years old. And this movie actually taught me the word fuck, believe it or not, because I remember actually pausing when they would say the word fuck. And I'm just like doing my thing, playing in the basement and stuff. My folks are watching this on the TV, and I'm just like, what does that word mean? And then my mom's like, I'm very liberal mother and stuff. She's like, well, it's, you know, when two people have sex, that's also known as this word. It's bad. Don't say it. And then as the movie progresses, they say fuck in a different way. It's more like, you know, an angry fuck, like fuck you kind of thing. And I'm just like, well, that doesn't make sense. How can two people having sex, how can you add the word you to that and then have that as an insult? This doesn't.
Perhaps one of the most interesting words in the English language today is the word fuck. Out of all of the English words that begin with the letter F, fuck is the only word that is referred to as the F word. It's the one magical word. Just by its sound can describe pain, pleasure, hate, and love. In English, fuck falls into many grammatical categories. As a transitive verb, for instance, John fucked Shirley. As an intransitive verb, Shirley fucks. Its meaning's not always sexual. It can be used as an adjective, such as, John's doing all the fucking work. As part of an adverb, Shirley talks too fucking much. As an adverb enhancing an adjective, Shirley is fucking beautiful. As a noun, I don't give a fuck. As part of a word, abso-fucking-lutely, or in-fucking-credible.
This movie really opened up a lot of doors for me, and I will also say that this movie, the last, say, 20 minutes of this film, totally freaked me the fuck out when I saw it the first time, and it's that visceral response that I really appreciate. I mean, you talked about The Shining. The Shining, also the first time I saw it, it was the only film that ever freaked me out enough that I had like a physical reaction to it. I got a headache watching it. And yeah, this movie, like the whole bye-bye life scene just really weirded me out. And a movie that can do that when I'm 9, 10 years old, great. A movie that can still hit me in the chest all these years later, fucking fantastic. And I appreciate how much this movie can get under your skin.
When you're talking about Cabaret, I've often said Bob Fosse regarded that as a horror movie. And it's instructive to regard that as a horror movie. I don't think that All That Jazz is entirely a horror movie, but I think certainly the last 30 minutes of this movie is a horror movie. And it's important and instructive to look at it that way. The way that it's cut, the way that it's structured, the way that it's performed and shot, it's a horror movie.
I actually spoke to our friend Lee Gambin, who told me that Fosse was considering doing Burnt Offerings after Sweet Charity. So that kind of makes sense. He would therefore put that horror sensibility into Cabaret.
When you see the rock stars that are playing the songs that they're having these dances at the end, when you see them with their painted faces, okay, great. They're a rock band. They're doing their thing. They're kind of looking like the supporting band for the Paradise from Phantom of the Paradise. And then when the camera turns around and you see the audience that's there, they also look like they're in some sort of a horror film with the painted faces, with this kind of death mask to them. So I completely buy what you're saying as far as that climax of the film looking like a horror movie. The one thing that I love about this movie is the rhythms. And we'll talk about the opening, but those montages of Joe Gideon in the morning with the Visine and the Alka-Seltzer and the Vivaldi and just those little things, that whole It's Showtime, folks, montages and how they play out throughout this film. And the way that we come back to them, like these little musical motifs or visual motifs, I just absolutely love that we have those, and they kind of signal like this is ratcheting up to another level.
It's showtime, folks.
It's showtime, folks. It's showtime. It's showtime, folks. Showtime.
Well, I think you can't really discuss this film without highlighting and going into deep dive on Alan Heim's Oscar-winning editing, because this movie, the way it was cut, I was going to say set the bar, but I mean, honestly, the truth is, what happened was Alan Heim worked with Fosse on Lenny in 1974. And what they found was Dustin Hoffman's performance wasn't, and this is according to, I think, one of the Blu-ray extras or some interview with Alan Heim that I read.
Well, yeah, Heim's going to say pretty much the same thing.
So I shouldn't tell the story. I'm just going to sound so smart. Anyway, very long story short, basically, they wanted to improve his performance, so they fractured the editing style of that film. But when it came to All That Jazz, Fosse and his co-writer, Robert Allen Arthur, baked that into the script. That was always part of the sell for this movie. That was always part of this movie. So it wasn't an editing room like save or something that was put upon this movie in post-production. This movie was always intended to be a fractured, disconnected, kaleidoscopic mosaic narrative.
Well, it also plays right into the whole 8.5 as far as like the way that is fractured as well. And I know that Fosse was a huge fan of that. And then he even used Fellini's director of photography, Giuseppe Rotono, to shoot this film. And it just looks absolutely gorgeous. And we can even say Sweet Charity was based on Nights of Cabiria, another Fellini film.
But does he love Alex in Wonderland? That's really what I want to know. Like, what did he think of Paul Mazursky's magnum opus with Donald Sutherland, which was also about a freaked out director trying to make a movie? This is a hot take. Not as good as 8.5 or All That Jazz.
The Twitterverse is just blowing up right now.
All of the Alex in Wonderland fans.
Oh, they are rabid.
Yeah, I bet. Like, all the 4 people who have seen it.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were talking about, Mike, with the little It's Showtime sequence at the start with his pills and the Visine and the shower, and how there's kind of little changes to that each along the way that sort of shows the progression or the disintegration of the character. But the repetitive scenes of the film are both shown right up front. I mean, they're out of context, so you don't actually understand until the film plays out how they work into it. But you have the Angelique world, the death world, and you have the morning ritual, both at the start, It's Showtime, into that incredible opening sequence. So straight away, and then there's that, so that you've got this recall over and over again, and it gives this sense of, this feeling of almost entrapment, like he's like a mouse in a wheel, just sort of going around or spinning his wheels. It's like, and I think we've all felt it, and that's the amazing thing about this film, even though it's talking about someone who's really living in a hyper reality to what most of us live in, which is the showbiz world. But there are so many aspects of what he's going through that the average person can understand. And I think that's why, you know, it's been argued a lot how self-indulgent this film is and how narcissistic this film is, but yet still everyone can relate to it, which is what has given it such an enduring quality. So that feeling of being stuck in the routine of our life. I mean, his routine is slightly different to what we all have, but he's stuck. And he's actually, Fosse as a person, or Joe Gideon, is someone who you cannot extract from the showbiz world. I mean, showbiz is him. He is showbiz. And it's kind of inevitable that he's going to roll along and hit this point where it's going to kill him. And that's what happens.
When we talk about this film, because there are so many similarities and it's so obviously based on a lot of what Bob Fosse had done in his life and certainly his romantic situation and his career and notable stuff that he, directed, like Lenny, what did they call it? The stand-up, excuse me. It's very consciously imitating Fosse's life and not trying to hide it at all. But the character of Joe Gideon is fundamentally different from Fosse in a number of very distinct respects. First of all, I don't think Joe Gideon would ever have made All That Jazz about himself. I mean, just think about it. It's like his character is self-involved, but he's not necessarily self-reflective. He's not somebody who actually would look in fact, if he's doing everything he can to not look inside himself and not deal with his addictions and his compulsions. Fosse was far more introspective and, as manipulative as he could be and certainly as sexually prolific as he could be with all the ladies and all the workaholic stuff and the cigarettes and all that stuff. The picture of Fosse that you get from other kind of readings of him, including the FX series Fosse Verdon, is not Joe Gideon. He's not as much of a, macho, dick swaggering kind of dude. He's a sensitive but compulsive artist who's incredibly introspective, incredibly concerned with how people view him and how he is viewed and how he is perceived. Joe Gideon in this movie, it does not appear that he could give a shit about how anyone, he's just there for the work. It's interesting to watch this because this strikes me as this is the man that Bob Fosse kind of wishes he were. Not who he is, but even with the warts and all and the tragic flaws and oh yeah, he's compulsive, he's self-destructive, all that. But the stuff that really got under Fosse's skin, which was how he was perceived, the perception that he might not be manly because of like, you know, his vocation, like, you know, like, and his sensitivity, really, you know, that's all absent from Gideon. And so I think in a weird way, in kind of like a putting down oneself way, this is kind of a wish fulfillment movie for Fosse.
In listening to Fosse talk about himself, he seems to see himself and his success as he sees himself as being a fake, that he is somehow has slipped through the cracks. He's not a real choreographer. He talks about the fact that he didn't know how to choreograph, how originally he was doing what people did at the time, which was buy a choreography and actually do the steps of someone else's work. And then he slowly changed things and started developing his own style. But you really get the feeling that he does believe that all of this, everything, all of the bullshit, and they do talk, you know, there's this sense of bullshit about showbiz. It is just all bullshit. He's a separate person, but he's completely in part of the DNA of showbiz, and he's kind of incredulous about it. I think the fact that he actually got Scheider to play the role of Joe Gideon, and it is a role reflective of himself, but I think that Fosse made an effort to avoid saying that it was him, because he would have taken away his creative freedom anyway if he had have said this is about me. By saying this is Joe Gideon, then really when you're making the film, you've got creative license. It makes sense for him to say, you know, it's someone else. It's not about me. I've taken aspects of my life, but it's not about me. But having Scheider, who is not a dancer, who's not a choreographer, it kind of shows that aspect of where he sees himself as a fake as well. He decided not to have someone as a dancer play himself, quotation marks, play himself in that role. And that makes sense, saying, you know, I'm just a guy, you know, who's just happened to have this success. I don't know how I've fooled them, but I've fooled them. There's this really strong sense of that.
Talk to a lot of creatives, especially creatives that are successful, you're going to run into that kind of imposter syndrome. I mean, it's so prevalent. And, you know, as much as Fosse wants to kind of poo-poo the idea that he's like a great choreographer because what he did was he took other people's dance moves and kind of riffed on it, isn't that what most artists do? I mean, you know, I don't even think Stanley Kubrick came up with like that perfect framing that he's known for with the wide angle and everything in complete order. I mean, he you know, and even if he weren't the first filmmaker to do that, we have centuries of paintings before that. So originality is kind of what you do with what's there and how you riff on it and how you twist it and how you bring other things into it.
He's completely warranted to be he's a great artist and he's a great original as well. And yeah, all art is derivative. That's just the way it goes. But you can see that's his frailty as a person within that, because he became Bob Fosse, the choreographer, the triple winner, the Oscar, Emmy, Tony Award winner in the 1 year. And I don't think he felt he recognized that person. But yeah, so having Scheider in that role really, you know, really emphasized that. But also I think watching Scheider play this part and sell the role of the choreographer not being a choreographer is quite astounding. It's an amazing achievement of acting, because actors act, of course, and they're all playing a part, playing a role. But in this case, he's playing a role with a whole lot of people who know dance, and he's actually has to show that he's a position. He has to be able to communicate this sense of authority over real dancers. And I think he completely sells it. There's not at one point that I didn't feel that he wasn't a dancer. I mean, there's a couple of bits in the end dream sequence where he looks a little awkward, but it kind of works. By then, you're right at the end of the film, and he's dying, so you kind of forgive him for anything. But the way he carries himself, I mean, he you know, he's obviously fit at the time, but he has that, you know, that sort of center of gravity that a strong dancer will have. And he just seems to be able to imitate Bob Fosse and translate that into Joe Gideon in such an incredible way.
When I was growing up, Fosse was a punchline to a joke that I never understood. Like, there's that moment in The Birdcage.
What about me? What do? Do I just stand here like an object?
No.
You do an eclectic celebration of the dance. You do Fosse, Fosse, Fosse. You do Martha Graham, Martha Graham, Martha Graham. Or Twyla, Twyla, Twyla. Or Michael Kidd, Michael Kidd, Michael Kidd, Michael Kidd. Or Madonna, Madonna, Madonna. But you keep it all inside.
I don't necessarily know what that means, but now having rewatched All That Jazz, going back and seeing Sweet Charity and Cabaret, now it's like, okay, now I know what you're talking about. Now I know of that very distinct style of dance, and that I love that Fosse, again, being very self-deprecating, talking about how, you know, his feet would turn in and his shoulders would hunch and all this kind of stuff, and that's why he came up with this style of dance. It was all based on his deficiencies.
If you haven't watched Pippin, which I think you can rent, it was videotaped during, I believe, its original Broadway run, or toward the end of it. It stars Ben Vereen and William Catt, and that was what he won the Tony for, and Martha Ray. And if you haven't seen that, please do, because it's really, really, it's a very well photographed Broadway production, and Fosse's genius is throughout.
The Fosseisms, like you were just saying about Mike, the sort of the turned in the pigeon toes and his hunched shoulders and all of that sort of thing, how he was able to make a complete style that everyone wanted to do out of his faults as such. They weren't traits that were, you know, encouraged in dancers, shall we say, is really interesting. And it plays out, and All That Jazz obviously has quite a bit of it in terms of the gloves as well, you know, this focus on the hands and bringing focus to areas of the body that you don't necessarily associate with dance. Because I remember actually once I was in Indonesia and someone commented on my fingers and they said, "You've got really nice long fingers, great for dancing." And my Western sensibility instantly made me go, "Huh? What do you mean?" And then I realized the Southeast Asian style of, jazz hands. The Southeast Asian style of dance is all that finger styling and the movement of the eyes. And Fosse does that in a Western way. I don't see much of an Eastern style in his, but he definitely does it in a Western way. And this amazing subtlety of the separation of parts of the body, like he does a bit in this where he'll get that, and Anne Reiking does it so well, that little sort of ripple wave in the abdominal torso or the tiny subtle hip movements and so forth. All that sort of stuff that's, you know, not about the feet. It's about other parts of the body.
So I do remember Pippin being on cable quite a bit when I was a kid. And going back and watching some of this stuff about Fosse when they played a clip from him as the snake in The Little Prince that was made for.
Yes. Isn't that a way that just came back on streaming? That like just I've seen a lot of my friends on social media post about The Little Prince, like, "Oh my God, I never saw this. I didn't realize Bob Fosse." I'm like, yes, and check out his moves. And the filmmaker Justin Simien, who's the creator of Dear White People, and he wrote and directed that film, did this Instagram story, which I saw, which had Fosse doing Snake in the Grass, and then put to Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, because so many of those moves are identical to what he did in Billie Jean like a decade later, except Fosse wasn't original on even those moves. They were identical to other moves that were done by other African-American artists like a decade before that, or not identical, but similar enough. So it's not like, you know, Fosse, like, and his work, it's like, it's very singular, but it's very much riffs on other stuff that came before. And even he would admit that. And then you look at Michael Jackson and certainly his performance. When was it? At the Grammys that he did the moonwalk for the first time? He won so much Fosse in that, and so much Fosse in some of his other stuff that came after.
There were commercials. When you and I, and probably when we were younger, there would be commercials for Broadway or for Broadway coming to our city. And Fosse was one of the first people to be able to do that. And he would shoot his own commercials, would shoot the dancers doing this. And it was great. Okay, cool. It felt like we had a little bit bigger of a culture, even though we were limited to 3 VHF channels and 5 or 10 UHF channels. It felt like we lived in a little bit of a bigger world because of the embracing of dance and, hey, this show is coming to a theater near you.
The commercials for Pippin were very, very significant because that was, I think, one of the first times that had happened. And number two, I believe he paid for it. I think that Fosse actually paid for those commercials because Pippin had opened in previews or something and it wasn't doing as well, or it had opened and it wasn't doing as well. And literally he was like, I am paying for these ads out of my own pocket. And after those ads started running, the box office started ticking up and it led to all these Tony nominations. That was a big deal for a prominent artist like Bob Fosse to be like, no, I'm gonna like literally buy ads on local New York television and New Jersey television to sell this show. That's how much I believe in it. I'm putting my own money in. And it worked.
It did. I think the show ended up going for 6 years. And I think you're right, actually, Dave. Unless anyone would challenge us, I'm pretty sure it was the first example of doing a TV commercial for a Broadway show.
I mean, we used to have TV commercials for the art museum in town or the zoo, and it's like, I just don't see commercials like that anymore.
Mike, when are we having a TV commercial for the Projection Booth podcast? That's what I want to know. I want you to buy 60-second ads on national television because, you know, the prices are coming down.
I want to find the people that put together the Dianetics commercial because that used to get me every single time. I'd be like, oh, this looks awesome. What is this? And it's like Dianetics. It's like, wow, that's got to be fantastic.
Nope, it's a cult. Sorry.
The dance sequences in this film, what I really like is there's a kind of there's almost three types of dance sequences. So you got that. And I was talking to Lee Gambin about this, and I'll give Lee's book a little bit of a plug. He wrote a book called
Lee Gambin. He is amazing. We love Lee Gambin.
He's incredible, and he wrote a book called We Can Be Who We Are, movie musicals from the 1970s. So if you want a deeper dive into everything in the Fosse landscape and the ecosystem, just to broaden your mind, read it. It's 800 pages, so it's quite incredible. Yeah, I was talking to him about this as well. So you've got this dancer's diegesis, right? So the music and the dance is presented in the context of a performance, right? So that's kind of pretty much the main type of dance in All That Jazz. So like if you had a biopic about a musician or something, that would be the style that you'd see, this dance, or, you know, music as diegesis. But then you have also the integrated dance, so the dance that's integrated into the narrative. So in many ways, that's as we get more magical reality in this film, that's where this goes. So it moves into what is kind of, in some ways, a lot of the golden age of movie musicals use the integrated dance sequences. But then you also have things that similarly have the two styles, like similar to all that jazz. So things like Sound of Music, South Pacific, they both have both of the styles. But then what I like about this is where you have these sequences where they're actually talking. It's actually a dialogue or a conversation, but the conversation takes place against the dance. And there's two significant moments of that in this film, which is that sequence where Joe is dancing with Michelle, his daughter, or talking with her and sort of workshopping a dance at the same time. And also when he goes in to see his wife or ex-wife, Audrey, played by Leland Palmer, and another similar sequence where it's played out against a dance, or he's kind of talking to her while she's dancing, and she kind of uses the dance moves as little punctuations and attacks against him. It's quite interesting, these sort of like emotive moments through it. You know, it's a film about dance that incorporates dance in some really, really beautiful ways. And the sequences, there's kind of the main sequences, the opening cattle call is essentially what you call a dance. Well, it plays out as a dance sequence, but it isn't a dance sequence, which is what is the most incredible part about this scene. It's essentially a montage at the beginning of a film, which is a very unusual point to put a montage. You know, montages usually sit somewhere in the middle to sort of move along the narrative a little bit and sort of condense time. to use a montage as an establishing sequence. I mean, we have montages essentially under credits, for example, or titles or something like that, but not in this way. This is like a post-title sequence. Yet we're introduced to the dynamic of all the characters, the main players in this film, within that montage to quite stunning effect.
I was reminded of another film that would come a little bit later, which was the opening of Staying Alive, which is how you don't do this scene.
You're not. No. We're talking about all that jazz, and you just brought up Staying Alive. I'm sorry. I have to hit the gong right now. That's like, no. What are you doing? Oh, I know it's what not to do. I understand what you're saying, but oh my God. Like, next you're going to be like, but the real discovery of that period was the apple. And be like, okay.
We've already done a 5-hour episode on the apple around here, so we don't need to go back to that one. I like what you were saying earlier about this kind of recasting, redoing the idea of Roy Scheider as Gideon, who is this not necessarily idealized version of Fosse. I mean, he has more hair than Fosse. He's a little bit sexier possibly than Fosse, but he isn't as deep as Fosse. But this whole idea, you already brought up the stand-up, this movie that is being edited through there, and that's another one of these refrains that we get, are lines from Cliff Gorman talking about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 Phases of Grief. And I love that he has pretty much rewritten history, so now it's not Lenny that he is editing, that he and Alan Heim are editing, that it is the stand-up, and that it's Cliff Gorman, who had been Lenny on stage, who had won a Tony for his performance, who should maybe have been in Lenny, but now he gets to recast it and have Gorman in this film and have all of these scenes of him editing that, and then we get those 5 phases of grief throughout this entire thing, to the point where when we're not watching the stand-up being edited, we get the VO from that as Joe's kind of meandering through the hospital in this little break between the musical scenes that we have, because we have some musical scenes where he's in his hospital bed and he's there both as the audience, quote unquote, and as the director. And those scenes of Scheider where he's both Gideon and the director, Gideon talking to himself, I absolutely love those. And then, yeah, that little sequence in between where he's wandering around the hospital, he kisses that old woman, and all of the voiceover is that stuff that Gorman is doing.
There's a lady in Chicago, man, wrote a book, Dr. Kubler-Ross with a dash. This chick, man, without the benefit of dying herself, has broken the process of death into 5 stages. Anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Sounds like a Jewish law firm.
It's really hard not to look at All That Jazz and not take into account the entire Bob Fosse career. There seems to be every aspects of all his films in. Look, you could argue there's aspects of all his films in all his films. It's just the way it goes. But especially All That Jazz. I mean, you know, that's where it seems like everything culminated, and then he went off in a different direction with Star 80, which was the only other film he made after All That Jazz. But this idea of Cliff Gorman, bringing him into it, when Hoffman played the role of Lenny. Similarly, he had with Shirley MacLaine playing the role of Charity in Sweet Charity.
Right.
That role should have gone to Gwen Verdon, and he knew that as well. But you know, forces that be at the time wanted Shirley MacLaine in it, and I can't help but think. And watching Cliff Gorman, I never had the opportunities to see Cliff Gorman play that role on stage. But to see him do those little snippets of the stand-up, as they call it, in All That Jazz, makes me think I actually wish he was in that role. As good as Hoffman was, he just didn't seem to have that maniacal edge or the grittiness, which I think is what Fosse likes to go for, that he likes perfection, but dirty perfection. and Cliff Gorman seems to have it, and he's just such a wired actor. I mean, you know, seeing him in the Boys in the Band, where he gets to play that overly effete role. And I think he was one of the few straight guys in the cast as well. And he was just sort of so over accentuated, but, you know, they were all playing sort of in some ways little stereotypes. You see that, and it's kind of like these alternate versions of Fosse films that I kind of wish I had have seen. Like even with Sweet Charity was a massive bomb. Although I love it. I just love that film. I think it's Fosse being enamored with film because it was his first actual film, and he just goes, you know, he's in hyperdrive. He's framing the hell out of things. He's, you know, the colors are just, but then there's that alternate ending, which is a happy ending to Sweet Charity. And it's, because Sweet Charity, the end is incredibly bleak. I think it's probably one of the bleaker films I've seen, because you travel with it across a long period of time, and it's just completely without hope at the end. And it's one of the few examples of where I've seen an alternate ending that's a happy ending. And I felt that it could have been the better version of the film, the alternate reality in Bob Fosse films. And yeah, Cliff Gorman as Lenny plays into that as well.
Emma, you mentioned his daughter, and I love this whole thing of, I tend to, in my mind, I diagram out things, and I had a little diagram with Gideon in the middle and then all of the women in his life that are just kind of offshoots going on, and just how important this is. I'm not trying to say that he's the sun and the women are the planets, because they are much more than that. They have so much influence, and just the way that he changes in order to interact with each of them, and then that the real woman in his life is this Angeline character played by Jessica Lange. And I just love those moments when he speaks to her, and the way that she changes in those scenes as well, the way that her outfits will change, the way that she is getting more and more, I guess, feminized. Like she's very feminine, yes, but the way that she has her veil off, and then the hat will come off, and then the hair will come down, and we just see this throughout these sequences. And I just love those, especially the one where it is his mother talking, and then you can see young Joe Gideon in the back, Keith Gordon probably, or maybe not, because he's so far off we wouldn't know, tap dancing in the background. Just that background, midground, foreground of that shot is just so gorgeous, and I just love the way that looks, and I love the way that these scenes act in the film.
They are beautiful. I think that what I like to think of it as is that this idea of him literally flirting with death. It's that little interplay they have with each other, and she's his conscience really talking to him. There's this beautiful moment where he talks about living with two women, and how one of them eventually leaves and leaves a note saying, I just couldn't do this anymore. Basically, I love you, so I had to leave. And he was referring to it. He's telling the story as though it was referring to him as the one that this woman loved. And Angelique says, what makes you think the note was for you?
Oh, yeah.
It's just gorgeous. But also that it's kind of like this dressing room, like the idea that it's this cluttered dressing room with all the paraphernalia, the bits and pieces from his life all collected in a dressing room. Because no doubt the dressing room is the in-between, the dressing room's a place you always go to. You go onto stage and then you go back into the dressing room. So it's a nice little play on that. And he puts on the clown nose and everything. And as we know, that kind of that Pagliacci complex of the clown, the performer, this idea that the show must go on, and you might be smiling on the outside, but you have to be, but you're crying underneath, It's been played out a lot in cinema, and in performance, and it's the duality of the performer. It's just what a performer deals with. I mean, you can't be on all the time, but you have to be on.
It's even broader than that. It's about art, and it's about being an artist. And even though the movie plays into some of, like, let's admit it, the most obvious tropes about being an artist, and the most kind of self-pitying tropes about being an artist, because I think one of the biggest criticisms of this film at the time and kind of throughout, its life is that it's kind of this narcissistic self-pitying thing, like, oh, I'm in love with death. Oh no. It's like this whole, which is minimizing, but there is an element of truth in that. There's nothing easier than saying, oh, look at me, I'm a tortured artist. And then doing it. The issue and the reason that this film works and is a great film, not only just because of the way that it's made, is because Fosse was a great artist. Fosse did things that no one really had done in that way. And it wasn't just about dance as a means of expression. It was how he marketed it, how he got it out there, how these things came out. The scene that you were talking about with the two ladies is one of the most, and probably of the entire picture, the most direct throwback to Cabaret in the whole picture. It's a very funny joke. One of the things you led me to was, we have to talk about the production design of this film. Very few films of this period have kind of rewritten the book on production design the way that this film does, because you have kind of like the dream netherworld purgatory, you have the cheesy TV death thing, you have the quote unquote reality with the hospitals and rehearsal stages and apartments. Every single set in this film, you could literally watch this film from front to back, and every single space that they shoot in tells a story. Every single one. And there's not one piece of ephemera in any of these parts, right down to that weird clock that he checks when he's romancing that dancer, whatever, like that weird digital clock thing, which is, and then there's like, the art in his apartment.
Oh God, yeah. Which is riffing right on his apartment.
Yeah. But then you go to those amazing sequences when he's like, under the knife, and you have the dance numbers behind the scrim on those like scaffolds where there are surgeons. You can see the surgeons in the shadows performing surgery while Leland Palmer and Anne Reinking and the actor who plays the daughter, whose name I can't remember, are all doing their little shtick, their three songs. And it's a riff on show business. It's a riff on the artifice of cinema. Which Fosse, even though he did very few films really as a major director, possibly like the least amount of films a major director has done during that period, that I can think of. He makes Kubrick look prolific. Every one of his movies is notable, but going back to the production design, it's like it won an Academy Award. It won 4 Academy Awards. One was for, I believe, production design. Philip Rosenberg. I'm just going to throw out some of these titles because you just can't believe it. It's like Network, Eyewitness, for those who like early Sigourney Weaver, Moonstruck, Running on Empty, The January Man, we'll forgive it, but it still looked really good. Bunch of Sidney Lumet, Q&A, A Stranger Among Us, Guilty as Sin, The Pelican Brief, Alan Pakula, Critical Care, I think that was also Alan Pakula. It's just amazing, like, the amount of artistry, like, down the line, and you talked about Giuseppe Rotunno's cinematography, and it takes a lot of talent to make something look mundane, like some of those hospitals, like, him just in the bed at the hospital flipping channels while, like, the nurse is giving him whatever, or taking his breakfast order, like, to that glitzy, cheesy, like, dance number where, he's gonna die with all that weird, the people in the audience and, like, those weird mannequins with the hearts lighting up, and, like, it's insane. Like, it's just the scope of this movie and the vibes and the tonality. Because you talk to any filmmaker, it's like you say, every film, every work of art creates its own universe. And you have to set that up in the beginning. Like, these are the rules. Like, you watch All That Jazz, that, Freddy Krueger's not going to come out of, like, a mirror or something. It's like, or an alien's not going to come out. It's like, there's no ghosts in All That Jazz. It's like you're setting up a world, and the world has to stay consistent. You're buying into this world. But the world of All That Jazz is spectacularly broad. And yet, it still feels consistent. And that is an enormous achievement and really, really hard to do. I mean, Kurosawa did it, but I don't know a lot of other directors that could pull that off. Even The Shining is reasonably, like, the dynamic range of tone in The Shining, even though it goes from quote unquote real to crazy Ghostville, is pretty narrow compared to something like All That Jazz.
The stage setup that they have the opening number on, that wasn't a real theater, that they like recreated a theater for that. That's wild.
And you hear about this. I mean, like every film fan who's maybe like never been on a set or made a film, you hear about how much work goes into these movies and how many people and how much expertise. It's helpful sometimes to just be reminded that it's a psychotic amount of work to make a movie. And to make a movie like this is probably psychotic multiplied by psychotic. It's exponentially psychotic. It's so much work, so many details, so much perfectionistic desire to get it exactly right, to get those dance moves exactly right, the costumes, the look, the saturation on the film, the production design, the performances. To have a work like this is like nobody who makes films, and this is, I think, why it's a favorite of a lot of filmmakers, and including the aforementioned Stanley Kubrick, who loved this film. It just makes you kind of sit back in awe. Like, how on earth did you do this?
I love that he's playing with the artifice when it comes to the Fly With Me number, where you get to see the people running through with the smoke pots and you see people with the flashlights. And then so it's like he's setting us up to be like, well, this is what is really happening in front of these backers, in front of these money men that are there. But there's no way. There's no way that the smoke is the same smoke that comes out of the smoke pots. There's no way that the lighting is just these flashlights that they have. There's so much more to it, but yet he's setting us up to say, oh, well, this is reality. This is really what's going on. But then just twisting it and saying, no, this can't really be what's going on, and just how elaborate that number is. And I was just, one more thing before I set down the conch, I was so happy to see Sandahl Bergman in that number. We've talked about her on the show before. She was fucking fantastic in Conan the Barbarian, and here she is doing her thing. She's a trained dancer, and to get to see her dance in this Fly With Me number is just fucking fantastic.
It's actually quite awe-inspiring to see her. And to see him, like what you were talking about, Mike, he literally shows the smoke and mirrors of it.
Right.
He's also, the timing was just right for Bob Fosse to come about and create Bob Fosse's style, because he's very unsentimental. And there was always, this idea during the golden age of musicals of the sentimentality, the singing of love to each other. And you can see that Bob Fosse, he doesn't believe in love in a traditional sense. He certainly doesn't believe in monogamy. And amongst that, in the polyamorous relationships that he was involved in, and no doubt is kind of, rife throughout showbiz. There's hurt, there's frailty. He was at the right time to just come out and show the grit of the musical. Perfect timing, because, with the whole changes in the 60s, just the social changes, people were ready. They weren't willing to buy the complete fairyland that those old sort of, even the Busby Berkeley style musicals were presenting. So he just kind of caught on this slipstream of the right timing, the social conscience, and just wrote it to this climax, which is All That Jazz.
I just want to throw out there that All That Jazz is also a favorite of mine, just because you get both Max Wright and Wallace Shawn in here, which are two of my favorite nerd character actors. They always bring something to the party when they come to play.
Yeah, Wallace Shawn's just in the negotiation scene, cut with the open heart surgery, isn't he? That's the only scene he really appears in.
Yeah, that whole scene where they figure out that Joe Gideon is worth more dead than alive. Talk about a cynical fucking scene.
David Margulies in that scene is so great. He's so great. He's one of those character actors. He's best known really as the mayor in Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, but he's a huge theater actor, and I saw him in Angels in America on Broadway a million years ago. He is so good as the numbers cruncher. The scene where he's adding up all the costs is just phenomenal.
Oh, talk about another cynical scene is when they go to meet with John Lithgow's character.
I can see where it'd be difficult to hold a cast like that together. It's really a shame. And of course, even after 4 months, a heart attack, there's no guarantee that he'll be able to work.
None.
Jules, it's still too bright.
Take number 7 down to 5.
And he's the greatest.
8 down to 2.
And Lucas, I think we have a sure hit. A sure hit.
Set the first.
Reads like a dream.
I'd love to read it sometime.
I'll get a copy to you this afternoon. Oh, I forgot. Wait a minute. I've got one right here with me.
All these machinations to oust Joe Gideon and get Lithgow in there because he's going to play by the rules, and Joe Gideon is just such a loose cannon. It's fucking fantastic.
And he was based on Michael Bennett, right? Like John Lithgow's like sneaky, snarly, I believe, but he's kind of gay, right?
Michael Bennett was partnered with Donna McKechnie, but I don't think it was, she was playing Beard.
I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that Michael Bennett was gay. He was gay. We can say this now. He died of AIDS. He's a legendary Broadway director. He directed A Chorus Line, among others, and he died of AIDS. And yeah, he was gay. We don't need to beat around that bush at all.
I was talking with Lee about this because it's interesting that Nicole Fosse ended up being in A Chorus Line.
Was that before her father died?
I think it was after, wasn't it?
Oh, he was probably spinning in his grave.
Exactly.
Well, one would imagine that Fosse would have been like, well, it's a job. You're an actor. You go do that thing. I got you your SAG card. You had, one line by a soda machine in this movie. So, there you go.
Anne Reinking basically played herself in All That Jazz. Well, as much as Roy Scheider played Bob Fosse, he didn't have neither Gwen Verdon nor Nicole Fosse appear in the Leland Palmer or Sabette Foldy roles. I'd be interested to know what the decision-making was behind that, because I don't think he was partnered with Anne Reinking at the time. They were separated, right. But he still made her audition for the role. I believe that's right.
Yes, they made her audition many times for this role to play herself. Literally play herself. Anne Reinking had to audition, and this is something she laughs about in interviews, and yeah, he maybe auditioned. He was a dick about it, but yeah, she got the role. I mean, can you imagine anyone playing Anne Reinking's role in All That Jazz except Anne Reinking? It's like it's inconceivable, to go back to Wallace Shawn for a moment. It's ridiculous. It's a singular performance. Nobody else could have done that. Nobody else could have danced like that. Nobody else could have played that role. And we should talk about Richard Dreyfuss originally having been cast in the lead role, too. Yeah, Richard Dreyfuss was cast, and he was deep in rehearsals, and he was unhappy. He was very successful. He was just coming off a Best Actor Oscar for The Goodbye Girl. He was super hot, and, Close Encounters was a huge hit. Jaws was a huge hit. He was a huge A-lister, and he's just like, I don't think the director likes me. And so he said this to his friend Roy Scheider when they were over at his place, and because they shared the same agent. And so Roy was just like, well, you're in rehearsals. You should probably quit the movie then. It's like, if you don't want to be there, you should go. And Richard Dreyfuss is like, yeah, I should go. And Richard Dreyfuss then went off to quit that movie. I don't know what he did. I know that he was, after his apex, he hit a few rough years because just due to his own, kind of personal issues and addiction issues, which he got past, which is, good. But then Roy Scheider got the call. Maybe he'd be interested, and apparently he ran into a lot of trouble from that, because there were people at the studio who didn't want him. They were like, oh, wait, you mean the Jaws guy? It's like, no. But Fosse fought for it. Yeah, the other Jaws guy, speaking of which. Before he had passed, you might have seen Robert Shaw in that role, and that would have been a very interesting movie.
That would have been fantastic.
He would have been auditioning people, and he would have just dragged his nails across a blackboard and been like,
sometimes the dancer go away, sometimes they don't go away. I'll never wear leg warmers again.
With Dreyfuss and Scheider being friends, and yet Dreyfuss not getting along very well with Bob Fosse, Scheider did get along really well with him. I think they maintained a friendship after the filming until his death.
They did, at least according to Scheider's interview. Yeah, he did say that.
There's a really good episode of the See Here podcast with Frank Santopadre talking about Dreyfuss saying, nobody wanted to see my little Jewy ass on stage.
But we don't get to see much of Roy Scheider. He just, really, when it comes down to it, we get to see he just does a couple of very basic dance moves. That's about all.
And I was glad in that the extras on the Criterion Blu-ray that he does settle something that I actually read about from some of the articles from '79. There was one that said, there's a rumor that Roy Scheider would take direction from Bob Fosse through a little device in his ear. And Scheider actually says, when we were doing that opening scene, he was up in the balcony, I was down on the stage, and he would feed me my lines, tell me what to say. And I love that. I love that realness comes through on the stage, especially those moments when there isn't dialogue, when he'll just like shake his head at somebody or like that little halfway grin that he'll get and the other person will grin back. And then it's a matter of like, is that person staying or not? I feel awful that we're going all the way back to the beginning of the movie at this point in our conversation, but just that scene by itself is so wonderful. And the way that plays out, the way that it's edited, I love the cutting on the people spinning, all those dance moves, and just to take that huge crowd of people down to that one line of dancers at the end of it. And that scene's 5 minutes long at the most? It's crazy how wonderful. You mentioned the use of the montage before, Emma. It's wonderful how that use of montage can just take that huge group all the way down to that amount, to take an entire day or more of rehearsals down to that, or tryouts, I should say, down to that little group of people. And then you get the interactions between him and these people that you'll see again in these different dances throughout the entire film.
With the earpiece, I think that Fosse had to, obviously couldn't prep Roy Scheider for everything that could possibly happen in that situation, because they did actually create a real cattle call environment, so a sort of anything goes environment, which is strange because with Fosse, Fosse goes for this kind of level of realism in his films, yet he is someone who, in terms of, I think, the direction in the dance or even in more intimate scenes, will be really, really specific, like where to put a finger, where to move, how to move your head or something like that. And that scene also, I guess, he probably had the trust of the people, because it's so meta detailing this. He actually had people that worked with him playing their actual roles in his life, in Joe Gideon's life. So, for example, the dance mistress who was, bringing everyone together on the stage, he worked with her all the time. Bob Fosse worked with her all the time. So I'm sure there was a confidence there that he felt that he knew she could bring it together. His accompanist on the piano was that person. Then even going into the other scenes and like Alan Heim, the editor, he played himself as the editor. There were a number of people who actually played their role in making the film within the film. So it's something that's another thing that you can pick out if you're so inclined in watching the film over and over again. You can just like find this detailing of people in the background of scenes and who are different people just in Fosse's life. What was the scene? What was the moment where Nicole Fosse, she was beside the actual...
It was a soda machine. She was rehearsing something, some move. And someone was like, can you do that somewhere else? Yeah, and she just like looked and scowled and walked away. I believe it was before Erotica, I think. I think that was right. It's a cliche to call it a love letter to the theater and a love letter to Broadway, but really, this is a love letter to Broadway. This is, even though it's kind of portrayed in somewhat negative light, where we're making this ridiculous piece of shit, Gideon dislikes the play he's in, the musical he's in, very much, as shown by the scene which is so famous where they're doing their first run through and all the actors are doing the lines and then they start laughing hysterically and the volume gets turned down and all we can hear is Joe Gideon tamping on a cigarette, taking a pencil, carefully putting it behind his back and cracking it in two. It's one of the most perfect scenes in a nearly perfect movie, and it's difficult for anyone who has never been in a situation like that in the theater to know what that's like, but that's, from what I gather, and I've never been on Broadway, but I've certainly been in theater situations, that seems to be exactly what it was like. And so much of that scene and the behind the scenes stuff and the running around and telling the actors, like, we all want to keep you around, when Gideon's in the hospital, straight through, Leland Palmer's thing, like, I went to see him in the hospital and he's all so happy and he's ready for a whole new hospital number. And it's intercut with her actually visiting him in the hospital and he's intubated and, looks like he's near death. It's about artifice. This whole movie is about artifice and how artifice is simultaneously necessary to help life happen and go down. And yet also artifice, if you buy into it too much or if you make that too much the center of your life, as Gideon does, will destroy you. Like, you could look at this as his like unfailing running from actual content, actual, depth. All he wants is the artifice because he knows he's good at it. He can manipulate, he can talk, he can do his little choreography or hand motions, or he can, do all this cool stuff. But what he's really afraid of is being himself. And going back to what we were talking about with like the differences between Gideon and Fosse, it's like, it's really a question of whether or not Fosse ever was so afraid to be himself. Certainly anyone who would make this movie could not have been afraid to be oneself completely. But Gideon is terrified. And it basically, you can say kills him.
He has, in this film, the most incredible self-awareness of his own character. I mean, people will talk about it in terms of being a therapy film as well, but it doesn't feel so much therapy as I need to go through this and have a realization and change. And that doesn't happen in this film. There's no actual character change. It's just him confirming what he knows he is. And it shows incredible insight into his level of addictions in every way, substance abuse, sex, women, perfection, yet an inability to change. And I don't think even really would want to change. I don't think that's what this film's about. So you've got this with this film where essentially it shouldn't work because we aren't getting any sort of character journey as such. It's more a reflection on what is. Yet it does work so well. I think mainly because of the light and shade within it, visually and metaphorically, figuratively, and in every way, but also because it comes in so well and it ends so well. And I think Fosse's really good at doing that. He's really good at opening and closing films. And the third act is a really unusual act. And it can be kind of perplexing to begin with, but it does actually get better on repeat viewing. And I think it's a really ballsy end. And if you can enter a film really well and end it really well, you can kind of get away with some purple patches in between. But a lot of films don't end well, especially nowadays, I feel. A lot of films kind of fall apart in their third acts, especially in the horror genre these days. But Fosse's film, that where it ends with him being zipped in the bag and the ultimate showbiz song, There's No Business Like Show Business, with Ethel Merman, the world's greatest belter, just coming in and, sending him out, and then going into the silence over just the white on black credits. I can't think of too many films that have done that, but I think if I remember one film that did that really had a big impact on me when I saw it at the cinema as well was Abel Ferrara's Bad Lieutenant, which was a harrowing film as well. And then you just went to this, these white on black credits with not a whisper of sound. He didn't even have a lead-in track into it. It was just silence. So everyone leaves the cinema and you've got this, everyone can hear each other, and you want to hide behind the sound and just have that moment of reprieve before, you have to face people after a film like that. Fosse doesn't do it quite as aggressively, but it's definitely there. It's like after showbiz, there's nothing for him. That's it. Silence, gone.
It's a very unsentimental ending, which, it benefits the movie, I think. And I think you're right about the ending and the beginning, certainly of this movie. If I was going to critique it, I'd say that it gets a little bit muddled after his second heart attack, and he's kind of wandering around the hospital and wondering what the meaning of life is. Because the issue is here, this is his arc. He's wrestling with his own mortality, but his whole character has been set up to avoid any of that kind of introspection. So it's kind of like when he reaches his quote unquote acceptance, really kind of up for debate whether or not he actually does reach acceptance, it rings sort of hollow because, like, so what have you been doing? It's, you're kind of, I found my sympathy for his character during this period. And I think a lot of the critics, when this originally came out, kind of honed in on this too. It's just kind of like, well, why am I rooting for you exactly? You don't even want to live. Like, you've been a shit to everybody. And you can, make movies about people who are shits. I mean, it's like, you can have that work, but you got to give me a reason why they're doing that. And I can read into it and say, this is all about him running from himself, with drugs or compulsions or women or work or whatever. It's him running from just sitting in a quiet room just with his own thoughts. He doesn't want to be in his own thoughts. He doesn't want to be in his own head. He doesn't want that introspection. That's really reading into it. That's not in the movie. And if we're going to look at just the movie, I think it's completely legitimate to say, you didn't pay for this. You didn't pay for this kind of catharsis. Like Bob Fosse and the other writer, Robert Allen Arthur, who passed away himself as this movie had come out and received a posthumous Academy Award nomination for it. I think it's completely legitimate to say, we didn't have the emotional investment in Joe Gideon at that point where he was about to die and dealing with his own mortality to have sympathy for him, because all we had seen was an hour and change of him basically acting incredibly self-destructive, talking to death, thinking it's cute, and suddenly he's faced with it and we're supposed to be like, well, yeah, what did you expect? It's like, where's the conflict here? What are the stakes? It's like, you've put yourself here. You've made this bed. And yet there's no moment, even in that moment where I think there's supposed to be a moment, there's no real moment where you get that he actually gets that he actually put himself there. That this is all his doing and that he could literally change it if he wanted, or he could have, maybe it was too late at that point. But you get the sense that even if he did, like, somehow make a miraculous cure and get up and go back, he would just do the same shit. He just pop the, speed and like do the pills and the smoking and the women. And, if it wasn't like right now, 3 months, he'd die, 6 months, whatever.
The conflict isn't in the character. The conflict is in the character of showbiz versus reality. And,
or artifice.
Artifice.
Yeah,
exactly. I think that's where the conflict is. We kind of look at it always in terms of a human character, but it's really interesting when you've got something like, an industry in this case, or a city. Often you can get conflict by having New York in the 70s in your film, just having New York, and that's what's playing out here more than anything, because you're absolutely right. Joe Gideon's he's stuck, he's just going to go and do the same thing. What's he going to do? Go and rest, There's not one moment in this character that we see he's going to have a nice lie down or a sleep in on a Sunday.
But think about how much more dramatic and I believe how much more powerful this movie would have been had they done that work, but Fosse and his co-writer, and basically wrote a 5-minute patch in there where he actually gets it. And he's like, wow, I've been running from myself, and maybe this is uncharacteristic, but, this is a narrative. You have to have an arc. And that's, the major, if there is an issue with all that jazz, that's the issue. And it's like, maybe he has a moment where he's just like, I put myself here. And if I get out of here, I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try to change. And then he dies. Now that's actually like, oh, wow, but it's too late. That's saying something. At least he would have an arc. The final number in this, he has literally resigned himself to his own death. And that's great. We should all be so lucky when we die that we're resigned to our own death. But at the same time, it's just like, but should you have been resigned to it? Is that a good thing? Or are you just embracing the same horseshit that you've been playing your whole life? Is this the ultimate indictment of a morally or spiritually bankrupt individual? what about his spiritual bankruptcy are you trying to say, Bob Fosse? Like, what is it that you're trying to say with this? And I think that's what tripped up a lot of critics. I still believe this is one of the greatest movies ever made. And, you know, for no better reason that we're having this conversation, that we can have a conversation about, like, you know, the meaning of life and all that stuff about this movie. I mean, that's a pretty high bar, but at the same time, it's like, I think it's valid. I think go back to your standard narrative, tropes. Like, you know, what did Joe Gideon want at the beginning? You know, what got in his way? Where did he get to? Did he achieve it? Did he not achieve it? You know, it's like, what's the narrative arc? And if you're going to say it's like Joe Gideon wanted to get away from himself and surround himself in artifice, then you have to go into why. You have to go into what. You know, you have to have him have his moment where he chooses artifice over reality, over his daughter and the people that love him. And then it's more powerful. But I honestly believe, and this is my main criticism of this film, which I think is one of the greatest movies ever made. They didn't do that hard work. They didn't make that hard choice. They did not have that character make that choice. And that, I think, is what's missing from all that jazz. And I think that is the one thing that makes this movie imperfect. I think almost all of it is perfect.
Maybe it could have been the best film of all time.
I honestly think it could have been up there with like Kane and Vertigo and A Matter of Life and Death and, you know, and Rules of the Game and 8.5 and, you know, all those movies, like, you know, Seven Samurai.
It's a good point, but it seems that it's kind of the film follows a similar trajectory to his other films, really. It's especially Lenny, you know, I can see a lot of Lenny in it. Sweet Charity as well, but Charity was a likable character, you know, so Charity was trying. She was the one who really was the eternal optimist, which is definitely not Joe Gideon or Lenny.
Well, just look at Star 80, which is basically where what I'm talking about kind of ate the movie. I mean, Star 80 is, and again, everyone should see it. It's a great movie, but it is really I really have to say, one of the most unpleasant movies I may have ever seen. Certainly one of the most unpleasant great movies you'll ever see, because it is completely, like, it's nerve shattering, and the end is about as negative and nihilistic as any ending of any great movie I've ever seen. It just leaves you with like, well, I should, you know, just jump off a bridge now. It's like, what's the point? It's, you know, and I think that impulse in Fosse to kind of glamorize the nothingness, the nihilism, the like, who cares and who gives a shit, which is so powerful in All That Jazz when they zip up his body bag at the end with that noise and they cut that song real sharply. I think that was his worst artistic tendency and maybe worst belief. If I knew him, I didn't know him personally. I can't make that judgment, but I think that was certainly something as an artist and maybe as a man he should have dealt with.
It certainly made his films for certain audiences, difficult to digest. And I think why a lot of his films, you know, why they've all been controversial, you know, no doubt Cabaret is the most successful for him. But Star 80 was like massively bombed. But unlike you, Dave, I think that's a great film. I absolutely loved it. And Eric Roberts is just shattering.
Oh, no, it's a great film. I believe it's a great film. And I appreciate it a lot, but I do think that it is bleak and unrelenting, and I would say maybe a bit pointless when it didn't need to be pointless. And I think its pointlessness was part of what he wanted to say. And that nihilistic, nothing matters kind of attitude, it's very difficult to make great art, especially cinema, where you have to be emotionally involved and be a complete nihilist. And I find it, because at the end of Cabaret, that's not a nihilistic ending. That's an impending doom ending. That's like, but look at like all of this like hedonism. Look at what this is going to bring. It was a warning and it worked. The ending of All That Jazz, you can read the most optimistic reading is that he, you know, lived as he died and he stayed true to himself or whatever positive spin you want to put on that. But the ending of Star 80 is nothing but a lurid, horrible, depraved tragedy. And again, I will say, you know, I agree. It's a great movie, It's so well done and so well put together. And I just wish he could have done more, like, I guess a little bit of introspection, maybe in his own beliefs and how he approached art, or how he approached certainly Dorothy Stratton. And, you know, I mean, the fact that I know her name, the fact that we're still talking about her and it's, you know, 2020, it's like, obviously she made an impact. So maybe, you know, the reality is maybe not as pointless and nihilistic as Fosse wanted to believe it is. So, I mean, I would just say the reality kind of like disproves his whole bullshit point about like nothing's worth anything, which is what you're left with at the end of Star 80, which is why I think all the critics hated it and why it bombed so hard.
Yeah, yeah. What was the line, actually? The line from On Erotica, we take you everywhere and get you nowhere. That's kind of the film. That's a synopsis.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a break and play a trio of interviews. First up, we'll hear from editor Alan Heim. After that, we'll hear from actor Keith Gordon. And last but not least, we will hear from actress Deborah Geffner. And we'll hear all of that right after these brief messages. This episode of The Projection Booth is brought to you by Tor Books. When George Romero passed away in 2017, New York Times bestselling author Daniel Kraus finished Romero's final zombie tale. Set in the present day, The Living Dead is an entirely new tale, the story of the zombie plague as George A. Romero wanted to tell it. Read The Living Dead by George A. Romero and Daniel Kraus, on sale now wherever books are sold.
Tuning into Sci-Fi TV. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Brent Barrett.
I'm Kevin Batchelder.
I'm Wendy Hembrock.
The Viewer's Guide to Genre Television.
Welcome everyone to a special supernatural focused bonus
Hello everyone, and welcome to The Fae Files,
a family of podcasts for the genre-loving television viewer.
Welcome to Saturday B Movie Reel.
Hi everyone, welcome to the study
welcome
group.
To the top genre characters of all time countdown.
And tonight we're going to be talking about Game of Thrones Season 3.
Find us at tuningintoscifitv.com.
I'm Chris Cooling from Forgotten TV, and you're listening to The Projection Booth, the ultimate movie podcast.
I really want to talk to you about all that jazz, but do you mind if I ask kind of how you got into the business?
I was not a very highly motivated college student in New York City, and so I dropped out of school in the middle of my first semester at City College. I had always been interested in the idea of being a photographer. I had been taking a lot of pictures at that age. I spent a summer actually selling filters in a camera store. I really didn't like the retail trade at all. And I decided I would go back to school, and maybe in the process, a friend of mine whom I had met the first year had discovered the film school at City College, which was called the City College Film Institute. And it was one of the oldest film schools in New York. It was a very well-kept secret. So by the time I found it, it was between leaders. Hans Richter, I don't know if you know him at all, but he was an artist. He made a lot of little expressionist films in Germany before he fled. He was offered the opportunity to be the head of the film school. Well, he left, and a guy named George Stoney took over for one season, and George was a great documentary filmmaker. He liked my work. And I discovered that I loved editing. I was the only student in several of my classes. I had to take my classes at night because there were no day session students. And a few years later, the school was closed. A little after I graduated from it, the school was closed because of some silliness on the part of the president of the whole school. So anyway, that's how I got started. And then while I was doing that, somebody recommended, George Stoney recommended me for a job carrying a camera up in the woods somewhere in the summer while a young director filmed his wife dancing through the trees. I think we've all had that on our resume somewhere. That led to a guy asking me if I wanted to work part-time in an editing house. So I did that weekends and occasional nights while at school. And I just loved it. And eventually I was a sound effects editor, and eventually I got this terrific break to edit some pictures.
You worked a lot with Sidney Lumet in your early days.
I had been a sound effects editor and a music editor on industrial films, documentary films, and television series in New York. I had done a favor for a guy who was editing sound effects on feature films he asked me if I would want to join him on editing sound for a couple of movies that were being done in New York at the time. One was The Fool Killer, which not too many people remember, but the other one was The Pawnbroker, Sidney Lumet's movie. I found myself editing sound mostly on that. The Fool Killer was just a strange experience all around, but The Pawnbroker was, a little earth-shaking. And then I did 2 more movies for Sidney as a sound effects editor. And on the third one, the second one was The Group. The producer of The Group, Sidney was off doing another movie. He was doing The Hill in England. And he never came to mixes. I never met him on The Pawnbroker, and I never met him on The Group either. But at some point, the producer came in and suggested changes. And the editor wasn't there, so I called the editor, and I said, you better call Sidney Lumet, because this is not good. And Sidney flew back and bailed out the movie in some way. He got back his right. He had final cut, I think, on the film. And then I did one more film for Sidney as a sound editor, and he asked me if I wanted to edit his next picture, and I said, you bet. So I did, The Seagull, and then a film called Last of the Mobile Hotshots, which was not the greatest experience. But Sidney was just a bundle of energy, and he stood right over my shoulder. He told me exactly where to cut. And I didn't always agree with him, but as far as structure went and things like that, but we got along very well. I had to leave Last of the Mobile Hotshots because I had a commitment to do Mel Brooks's movie, The 12 Chairs, over in Yugoslavia, and so I left it in the hands of my assistant. And Sidney, I think, was kind of pissed off with me at that. But a few years later, I ended up doing network for him, and it was a very different experience and very pleasurable.
How was that transition of going from a sound editor to a picture editor?
Well, I desperately wanted to do it, and I was going to stop editing sound effects to really try very hard. I was going to apprentice myself to a documentary editor I know, because I just felt sound editing was not sufficiently challenging to me. Before I could do that, this great break for me happened where Sidney asked me to cut. And because he stood over my shoulder, I learned an enormous amount from him. I learned about making quick decisions and sticking with them for a while. And I learned how to read actors' performances. He was great with actors. He was great with cameramen. He wasn't great with editors for the most part for a while. And then he started working with Dee Dee Allen, and he did Serpico and Dog Day with her. And actually, I was kind of surprised to be called to do network. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I had already worked with Fosse at that point. And Fosse probably put some pressure, not pressure, but he probably suggested me to Patty Chayefsky. And when my name came up, Sidney said, yeah, why not? And he never stood over my shoulder in that movie. So, because I would have left at that point. I was a better editor than Sidney, in a way. I was more fluid, less rigid. Sidney had a tendency to be very mechanically rigid sometimes. And Dee Dee broke him of that habit. He really appreciated what editors could do after that. So he did, they left me pretty much totally alone on network. It was one of the easiest and most rewarding films I've ever worked on. Sidney does not shoot a lot of material. I think we went into a mixing studio 5 weeks after they finished shooting, which is pretty astounding for a feature-length film like that. Yeah, it was ready. I turned it over to sound after 10 days, so we were pretty good shape.
I love The 12 Chairs, and that's one of the Mel Brooks films that I don't think gets nearly enough credit. It was so good.
I didn't realize how good it was until later. I was a sound effects editor on the producers, the original producers, and I took over because Ralph Rosenblum and Ralph was the editor on that, and Mel and he never got along at all. So there was a lot of tension, and Ralph had another commitment. So Mel and the producer of the producers, whom I knew from a documentary I had done sound for, they suggested that I take over the film. And I said, yeah, sure, with great trepidation, absolutely terror. the thing that had to be done, there were a couple of things. One was getting the main title sequence ready. And that was not on me, really. That had all been set up and it was in the works. And the other one was a sequence in the middle of the movie where they buy the script from the Nazi and the producers. And it was not getting laughs on the page. It was hilarious. And in the dailies, it was hilarious. So Mel asked me to work on that. And he said, so I'll come in Monday and we'll start. And I said, well, why don't you leave me a couple of days to look at the material and let me make a version of it. And I don't know where I got the courage to say that, but I did. And I recut the sequence the way I felt it was right. I discovered in the process, because this was done on film and you could see where the other editor, where Ralph had made his cuts, and my cuts were within a third of a second on most of the material I used in that sequence. When we screened the film for cast and crew and other people on 3rd Avenue, I think it was an open screening with a whole section for cast and crew, the laughter was so enormous that I just loved the idea that I could take this material and make it work, as it were. I mean, editors say that a lot, let's make it work, because the theory film theory comes to a crashing halt when you get into a cutting room. I've said this before, and you'll hear from other editors too, but one of the difficult parts about being an editor is that you interpose yourself between the director's idea of what he shot and what he really shot as far as a movie goes. It's another rewriting process, and good directors understand that. I just love the idea that I could take part in this, I could get a response from people, and without actually going deeply out on a limb myself. Nobody was handing me many millions of dollars to deliver a movie. They were just paying me my meager salary, so I loved it.
Tell me about the first time that you and Bob Fosse worked together. Tell me more about how you got the gig for Liza with a Z.
My late wife had seen Cabaret, and I hadn't gone to see it yet. When I got a call, she said it was just wonderful. I had to go see it. So I got a call from a producer I knew, a guy named Kenny Utt. I knew him from television, where I was a sound effects editor, a couple of New York series. Kenny called and asked if I would want to meet Bob Fosse. And so I went to Broadway Art Studio in New York, which is replicated in all that jazz, right down to the faucets on the sinks. I met him right after lunch. He was standing in the middle of the floor, and I joined him in the middle of the floor, and dancers were sliding right up to his feet like stealing second. It was just, the energy in the room was absolutely spectacular. And I really wanted to take part in this. And anyway, we talked for a while, and I'm not a musician, so he didn't seem happy to discover that I wasn't a musician, but I really wanted to do this movie. And when I left the meeting, I called my wife and I said, I'm going to see Cabaret. I'll be home after the whatever show it was, whole dinner. I went to see Cabaret, and then I really wanted to work with Fosse. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I just wanted to work with this man because visually and then, emotionally, I thought this was brilliant stuff. The next day he called me, and Kenny said the job was mine, and we worked very nicely together, so nicely that when he did Lenny, he called me and sent me the script, and I was thrilled by that script. And that's really a film that I became a full-fledged editor on. I just learned so much from Fosse about, again, flexibility and moving the eye within the frame, and then how to cut dance, and which is no different than how you cut anything else, really, because what an editor does is guide the audience to the next cut. Sometimes it's within the frame, sometimes it's juxtaposing different frames, but basically you have to just keep the story moving and make it interesting, keep the audience leaning forward and ready to move. So I learned that from Bob. And then on Lenny, which was a great script filled with complexity and time jumping and the various structural things. And on Lenny, he said to me one day, I'm not liking Dustin's performance. It seems he's begging. And that's what was happening. Dustin, like many actors, wanted to be or wants to be liked. Later I did a film called Billy Bathgate, and Dustin was in it, and he was playing Dutch Schultz, for God's sake. And he wanted, he really wanted to be liked in that movie, and he was a killer, a vicious killer. Anyway, and to go back to Lenny, I said to Bob, I have an idea on how to make his performance seem edgier. And Bob said, take a shot. So he disappeared for a day or so, and I reworked a couple of scenes where the structure was basically Lenny is doing a routine, and we would then either go to what triggered it or come off, before going into the routine, we come off something that triggered it. And what I did was mix those up much more so that the whole rhythm of his performance changed. It became much edgier because it was much shorter and tighter, and it seemed to just move. I really became very confident of myself as an editor then. It was several years into my career as an editor, but that was when I really felt confident for the first time, I think, that I knew that I could make a career out of this.
There's a whole through line in All That Jazz of the comedian, a.k.a. Lenny, and that whole cutting process. Was it as painful in real life as it is in All That Jazz?
No. We worked together really, really well. There was just a lot of give and take. Bob was very open to everybody on the set and in the cutting room. He would listen to everybody's ideas. There are a lot of people who won't do that. And I've been the same way also. I always show my cuts to my assistants and get their opinions on things and hope they're being honest. What happened on Jazz, it was a little different. So it was always difficult to work with Bob because he was a perfectionist, but I think most editors are kind of perfectionists. He always wanted you to do better. And that's for everybody who contributed to the movie. So everybody really felt that they were doing a really important thing working on this movie and doing the best work they can, which every director should want. Right down to food services is doing the very best work they can. And then the film shows it on some level. People do a little extra. That's just part of the job. And we never had disagreements on Lenny or on Liza with a Z. We might have differences, but then we discuss them and then work them through. I'll tell you something that happened on Star 80, which was the next project I did with Bob, unfortunately the last one. We were never happy with Mariel Hemingway's performance. There was one scene that she just didn't do it. As I remember, it's a long time ago, but there was, I believe, a scene in the bathroom. She was supposed to cry, and the crying was not real. It was just fake. We worked on films for a long time, Bob and I, together. 11 months to 14 months on the 3 movies I did with him, not counting Liza with a Z, which was pretty short. But it's a long time. It's almost a year to spend with somebody in a cutting room. And we usually would work a scene. I'd show him something. We'd work it till he was happy, and then we'd move on to the next scene. And we rarely went back. But one day he came in and he said, that bathtub scene, let's look at it again. So we did. And he made a suggestion. And I did it. I tried it. And it was wonderful. And I said, that's a great idea. And he said, yeah, I'm not surprised you like it. It was your idea 3 months ago. People don't do that. So it makes you feel that you're contributing. But by that time, everything was good. We did have some tension on Jazz. I'll tell you the story, but for one thing, Jazz was delayed twice. And this was a very big movie for Bob. It was, though he denied it, his story. And that comes into it later. But there was one, also I had my wife and I, my late wife and I had a child around that time. Let's see, the film was delayed once because Bob wanted to cast the wrong actor in the role. He decided to change it the first day of production. Well, the first day of rehearsals, second day of rehearsal. The actor was clearly not taking direction, was trying to actually direct some of the dancers. And Bob was not happy. And we had all told him we didn't think this guy could do it, so we had to wait for Roy Scheider to be available. They put us all on half pay. Roy was doing the movie. Well, they put me on half pay, and I think they did it with everybody in the crew because Bob wanted to keep his crew together. So by the time we started, there was an enormous delay. And then 6 months, 3 months, 4 months. And then we started, and, well, Bob took a break around Thanksgiving to choreograph the erotica number. Our producer and Bob's co-writer, Robert Allen Arthur, died of pancreatic cancer. Earlier, people had heart attacks and healed and came back. People had babies on the production. It was sort of amazing. It was like life. Anyway, Bob, when he finished, and we went way over schedule. I used to know the figure, but I forget how many. Almost double the schedule. Everybody said, Kenny Utt included, we all said, Bob, take a week off, because directors usually do. And it gives the editor time to straighten things out and see how closely you can get to catching up. And in this case, Bob he wanted to come right into the cutting room the Monday after they finished shooting. We all thought it was a mistake, but he did. There was a great deal of tension between us. Partly it was my fault because I kept referring to the character as you. And he said, it's not me, it's Roy or it's Joe, but it's not me. And of course, the address on the pill bottle was almost his address. It was like one digit off. There were a lot of people in the movie who played themselves, me included. I just couldn't stop calling the character you. And he got pissed off. And one day he said, you were a better editor before you had a kid. That hurt me. That really hurt me. When I went home that night, I talked to my wife and I said, I've got to change what's happening in the cutting room because I'm not going to. Two things. One, I really want to finish this. I want my name on this movie. There's going to be a great movie. But secondly, I knew I couldn't last as long as this was going to take if there was going to be abuse between us or tension between us like that every day. And it had been going on for about a week. Fortunately for me, sometimes editors have to think very quickly about the line they're crossing and what's gone on exactly. And fortunately for me, my first scene in the movie was coming up, and it's a scene where it's not in the movie anymore, I tried very hard to get most of me out of it. I wasn't much of an actor. But Bob thought I could do it, and he didn't spend much time with me. He was so worried about Roy. So, I looked at myself, and I was not happy. But this was a scene where Roy comes in, sits down next to me at the cam. He's got a cough, which I had lived through on 2 movies already. I was supposed to raise my eyebrow and look at him just in a kind of a disapproving way. And Bob kept the camera running, and he did a close-up of me in 5 consecutive takes. He would cough, and I would raise my eyebrow. And he kept saying, smaller, smaller, which is what most good directors say. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of me, but I have very big eyebrows. And the first take was not very good. But by the 5th take, my eyebrows were like the villain in a Chaplin movie. They were like 2 giant beetles flying up toward my forehead. And so when I cut the scene, I had used my first take. And Bob was looking over my shoulder at this scene, and he said, well, let's look at the other takes. And I said, okay, you're not going to like it. And I said, I'm much bigger in the other takes. And then, anyway, he looked at the other take, the rest of the take, the other 4 takes, and he turned and he walked across the cutting room and he kicked a wastebasket, which I never saw him do. I never saw him actually do anything physical, except dance, of course. But, he just kicked a wastebasket across the room and he said, how could I let you do that? And I said, Bob, don't blame yourself. I'm not an actor. And Bob said, you're not an actor, but you're a human being, goddammit. I should be able to get a better performance out of a human being. At that point, I said what turned out to be the magic words. I said, Bob, that's the nicest thing you said to me in a week and a half. And he broke up. He absolutely broke up. And after that, it was just butter. It never came up again. And everything was absolutely cool. But I've worked with people that I don't like, that I, really don't like for various reasons. I've worked with people who don't have a lot of talent, but want to make the best movie they can, which is the most you can hope. And I've worked with arrogant people who basically have something in their head and they don't really think it can be improved. Is that clear? And I've worked with a couple of really unpleasant people. And I've had a pretty long career, almost 60 years. And there's only a couple of people that I really couldn't stand. And Fosse was just a pleasure to work with. Whatever people say, he was difficult. Yeah. And then again, I wasn't a dancer. You know, I wasn't a particularly a woman dancer. He wasn't looking to seduce me, and he wasn't looking to, I had no stake in this except to make the best movie I possibly could. So it was always a pleasure to work with him because I knew that was what was going to come. I mean, I didn't know I'd win an Academy Award. I don't have that kind of ego. But once the film was finished, I would have been really unhappy if I hadn't been nominated, I'll tell you that. And I wasn't nominated for Lenny, which Bob insisted I should have been nominated for, and he was right there, too. But that's another story.
You talked about the time jumps that were in Lenny. Were those kind of things in the script for All That Jazz? Because you move around a lot in that film.
The script of Lenny had a lot of time transitions in it. In fact, Ralph Burns, who was Bob's composer and arranger on many, many projects, including film and theater. And Ralph used to say to me, or said to me one day, there's real time, there's flash forwards, and there's flashbacks, and then there's Fosse time. And we worked in Fosse time, and I loved it because you had a lot of freedom. So Bob took what we had done on Lenny and carried it to a much further degree in the structure. Again, working with Bob Arthur, carrying it. It was very tight. And a lot of it was written that way. But when we found that we wanted to make some major shifts and changes, it was extremely difficult. And I was talking recently to a director who really studied the movie. And she asked me specifically if I remembered any places where we did make cuts. Without her on the phone, I came up with one place and I called her back because she had read the script many times while watching the movie. I called her back and I said, yeah, the sequence where he's comparing the angel character to a rose and talking about that, that's a sequence we cut a lot out of. But mostly we found ourselves limited because the script was so tight at that point. Within the scenes, of course, it was a lot of flexibility. The erotica number we added, I think, not a lot, but the dance was so beautiful that we really wanted each pair to finish, and we couldn't do that within the music as written. So I added, I think it was a bar and a half. I think Ralph Burns never quite forgave me. But you can hear it if you're listening. You can hear the repeat. And also at the end dance number, which I wanted to make shorter, to make longer. So we ended up, of course, making it longer. Later, he said he should have made it a little shorter. But that, too, has a couple of bars added. Again, it's such wonderful material. You hate to get rid of it, any of it. I just felt it was getting a little long at that point. But I'm not going to complain. I've been dining out on that movie for 50 years. So look, I'm talking to you. So
you mentioned Kenneth Ut, and he is like one of those unsung, to me anyway. I just haven't read and heard enough great things about him because I just always enjoyed him, especially later in his life when he was showing up on camera, when he was working, especially with Jonathan Demme.
He played cops and things. Yeah, right.
Or when he was in Miami Blues and he was the Hare Krishna. He was so fantastic in that.
You know, I don't think I ever saw the movie. I'll have to watch it now. Kenny was an interesting guy. I don't know if you know this, but he had been a chorus dancer in the original production of Oklahoma. And I met him when we were doing, I think it was a show called The Nurses, a TV show that was exactly what it sounds like, The Nurses. It was done by the same producer who did The Defenders. I don't know if you remember that at all. But that was a high-class black and white lawyer show done in New York. And then he did The Nurses, which had a couple of seasons, I think. And he was the producer of Godspell, the movie version of Godspell. And he called me and asked me to do the show. That was after Liza with a Z, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. I never had seen the show. I am not a guy who likes religiosity, as it were. I had never seen the show, and Kenny said I should go see it with the director. And I had met the director before, and they wanted to hire me. And I turned it down, and Kenny said, go see it with the director. So I went and I saw it, and I really hated it. The kids in the show knew that David Green, the director, was in the audience, and they were playing to him. And I could see it, and I'm just, basically at that point in my life, really a layman, but there was a lot of begging going on. And I told Kenny the next day that I just didn't want to do the show. And he said, go back again. Go back without David and see what happens. And I went back and I found the show very winning because they were not playing to this one guy. They were just having fun. So I did it. And that was also just a wonderful experience. So Kenny, yeah, he's had quite a reach in my life. Yeah. He was also the producer, I think, of Star 80. And he was much loved in New York. There is a film that was made. I don't know if you can find it anywhere. It's called The Utmost. Yeah. Anyway, he was quite a character.
You talked about how you would call the Roy Scheider character, the Joe Gideon, that you would say you when you're talking to Fosse. How close was Joe Gideon and Roy Scheider to Bob Fosse?
Probably very, and not just physically. Bob wrote the character to be. Bob knew show business, and he had a very warped view of it. He says it in the movie. I love show business. I hate show business. And he had that kind of a thing because he worked since the age of 13 in vaudeville. He knew what he wrote about. But after he won the Academy Award and the Emmy and the Tony. Yeah. That year that Liza with a Z, he won a Tony, and he got an Emmy for Liza with a Z. He got a Tony for Pippin and the Academy Award for Cabaret, which is not a bad triple header. And he could have done any movie he wanted. And what he wanted to do was Lenny from the play. And it was it was kind of perverse of him to want to do that. It was a low-budget movie and a lot of grief because he, of course, went over budget and they were cutting scenes and before they were shot. So that was a very tense situation. I think he was tremendously relieved to come into the cutting room where he didn't have to go on the set and fight with the producers every day. Roy's an actor. But Bob, the character, I think, Bob based a lot on his life. He was a remarkably charming man. I don't know how his life would have gone in this Me Too era. But no, seriously, I've thought about it. But I do know that when I was doing Lenny, he invited my wife and I to a party he was giving in his house on Long Island, which is the first time I met Chayefsky, and who cheated at croquet, by the way. But it was a wonderful party. It was really a party for the cast of Pippin. There were a vast number of beautiful women there, and men, and, dancers, and all various people. And at one point, a lot of great things happened that night. But at one point, my wife, Bob came over and asked to dance with my wife, who was an attractive woman, but hardly a Fosse dancer. When we were going back home that evening, she said to me it was really remarkable to dance with him because when I was dancing with him, I felt I was the only other person in the room. He had a concentration about him. He would sit with you and talk and over a cup of coffee or something, and you'd say something, and he did this with actors a lot. You'd say something, and much later he would use that to get a performance out of somebody. He would use some personal information. He basically did it with me, I think, in the story I told about having a kid. He probably wanted to break the tension as much as I did, but at that point, I just wanted to do something. He was intense, but he was charming, and he was a seducer. But he seduced everybody that way, men, women. It's a good thing. I don't know. I mean, if I were working with him now and we were all, 40 years ago and people started accusing him, I don't think he ever paid all his debts. There's a woman we cut out of All That Jazz. No fault of hers. It just didn't fit at some point. There were a lot of people got cut out. But he then cast this particular woman. He cast her in Star 80. One of the chorus dancers says that, I did fuck him and he didn't cast me either. He didn't, it was not a transactional relationship. You either liked Bob or you didn't. And if you didn't like him, you didn't sleep with him. He didn't hold anything against you as far as I know. But I know there were actresses he wanted to sleep with and wouldn't. They wouldn't sleep with him, thinking it was a bad career move or other things. He was a guy. He was a guy with particularly heavy, sexual desires. And then he must have been a very good lover. I have no idea myself. But I hated that show that was on, the Fosse-Verdon show. And most of us who worked with Bob didn't like it either, to say the least.
One of the most remarkable sequences to me in All That Jazz is those breaks that you do with the classical music where, it's showtime, folks. And I was curious, how did you approach those to make them each so different and to just move the story along so well?
Bob shot those with, I suspect, an idea in mind. I mean, he didn't do anything casually. So, when it starts off, when Roy turns around, he's got the cigarette in his mouth in the shower, and it's a bit of a laugh. As those things progress, the image, particularly the ones from behind of Roy, with the black shirt and everything, by the end of it, he's looking, his arms are out, I think, he's coughing. I think the last one might have been after he drops his daughter off. It's been a while. But after his daughter leaves him after the dance sequence in the studio, and he's coughing really badly. And I think that's when we went to the one where he's shot from behind at a low angle. He looks almost like a crow or some kind of carrion bird. The idea was that basically the sequences were approximately the same length, but we wanted them to be more tougher as we progressed, harder, more visually striking. So some of the shots were the same, but the ones of him were different. Bob also had an amazing ability to get a camera into a room with mirrors on it, and you never saw the camera. I don't know how he did that. If you think about the movie, there's so much mirrors in it, so many mirrors. As was, Cabaret had all of those distorting mirrors and things. He liked mirrors, no question.
Star 80 was, I can see the similarities between what he had done before and with Star 80, but it just always felt like such a different film.
When we were finishing Jazz, I was doing something in my cutting room, and Bob came in one day, and he said, I just found the next film I want to do. And he gave me the article from the Village Voice about Dorothy Stratton. I had read the article in the Village Voice, which was something we used to read with some regularity in New York. And when I looked at it, I said, oh boy, this is an unpleasant story. But again, it deals with show business. It deals with manipulating women. I thought it was very much the kind of film that Bob would want to do. That's an interesting film because everybody did such great work on it. The film was basically unwatchable without, it was just so good. And we were all shocked at how vicious the reviews were. I was doing a film shortly after that on location, and the producer of the film, whom I had met fleetingly, saw me in a coffee house at a breakfast place and knocked on the window and asked if he could join me, and he did. And we were talking for a while. He said, you seem like a nice guy. How could you work on such a vile movie? I was stunned. And I know what he means. And in retrospect, well, people in California hated the movie. And Bob did not much like Los Angeles in general. He spent a lot of time here as a young choreographer and a young dancer. But I don't know. And when he said vile, I understood what he meant, but I was also shocked because I felt that the artistry of it pretty much pulled it off. Bob got very depressed after that. He didn't think the reviews would be anything like what they were. He had bought a house by this time out in on the island where he'd been renting for years, and he had built a dance studio in the garage, I guess. He just disappeared for a while. And then much to my surprise one day, he showed up in the room next to me. He was helping out his friend Herb Gardner, trying to make, I think it was The Goodbye People, trying to make it a better movie. Because Herb was a guy who would not give up things easily. And a good friend of mine was editing the movie, and he was desperate. And Bob showed up and he came in and spent a couple of weeks doing changes with Herb. And, I mean, he was he was very close to his friends, very tight.
You mentioned giving a lecture at a class, and I was curious, what else are you up to these days?
I'm mostly retired. I am retired, but I'm the president of the Editors Guild out here. It's a nationwide guild of about 8,300 members. And we're, like everybody else, trying to get some health standards so we can send everybody back to work. Not only us, but more importantly at this point, the crews, because if they don't shoot stuff, editors are not going to have much to work on. So between my business agent and myself, we spend a lot of time in Zoom meetings, and mostly her, trying to educate the producers and the medical people, the professionals who've been asked to help us out, both sides, the studios and the crews. And, film crews, they work in very close quarters. People say, well, you guys don't have a problem, you editors, you work alone. That's not really true. There are a lot of people who come through a cutting room. And it's not right to have the editor say, well, you can't bring in your entourage. There should be a nice sign that says no entourage, if you know what I mean. I'm simplifying it, but we work with a lot of people all the time, in and out, assistants, post-production people, apprentices, and producers and directors. So they're always coming in and out, optical people, CGIs. So we have issues. And editors have been working from home since they closed down the studios. But that pipeline is drying up, of course. And there are many questions with working from home. Who pays for the equipment? Are you getting a decent rental for it? Is your electricity sufficient to run the machinery? And on and on and on. And is your Wi-Fi good enough? So all of this is stuff grist for the mill, and it's all to be discussed, and we're still discussing it, taking a really long time. But that's what I do. The only person I really want to work for anymore is Nick Cassavetes, but I'm not that interested, simply because I like the idea of not working. I've always been good at that. And Nick has asked me for years now to do his next movie, but unfortunately the last one was, I think, 6-7 years ago. His projects keep falling through. So now, I'm really liking being unemployed. Why don't you try it?
Well, Mr. Heim, thank you so much for your time. This was such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Welcome back to the show, Keith Gordon. Keith, if you could, please tell me, what do you remember about working on All That Jazz?
The thing with All That Jazz now is you're talking about so many years that obviously my memories are not as rich and bountiful, and I wasn't on it for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, but there were some very memorable things about it. I mean, it was a very intense experience. I was a huge Bob Fosse fan at the point I got the job. It was trippy to get the job because I'm not a dancer, and a hefty chunk of what the part is doing is dancing. And I was very honest when I went in and auditioned, and, he said, what's your dance experience? And I was like, 0. And I said, to be honest, I'm one of those people who falls down when I walk. So, and he was very sweet and was like, don't worry about it. If we do this, I'll make it work. And, that was where I kind of experienced some of his genius sort of firsthand was, him getting me to do these couple little quasi bit of a step that he would use for very short cuts and intercutting me with a double. And, it looking very seamless and very flawless, which was, somebody who's interested in filmmaking, it was fascinating to me because, I'm doing a couple of those little moves and I had no idea what the hell I was doing. And he actually made it look like I did between doubling me and shooting me in tiny pieces. And so that was very cool. And then being there for the whole end sequence was really cool because I didn't really have anything to do much as an actor. So I just kind of got to hang out with a bunch of wonderful actors and watch this amazing sequence be shot. So it was pretty exciting. I unlike De Palma, Fosse wasn't somebody who wanted to sit around and chat a lot. I mean, De Palma was much more like a teacher personality. So being on De Palma sets was much more kind of, I felt much more comfortable bugging him and saying, so what lens are you using and why are you putting this in? Fosse never had that vibe. He was definitely like not chattery and was focused on what he was doing. So I just had to try to quietly sit and watch, but that was pretty thrilling. That part of it was really, really interesting. And then I also got a taste of the kind of darker side of Fosse, which, he was sort of famous for, which was his manipulative side, which I didn't know so much about then. But I've heard since then many, many stories where, because like I was doing the scene where, I was being, like molested by these three strippers, and it was very intense. I was like, 17 years old or whatever. And if I wasn't a virgin, I was close. I mean, I was not somebody who was like super comfortable with three naked women, grabbing me and rubbing my crotch. And it was a little, it was sort of really interesting but it wasn't like an erotic experience. And so we're shooting it and Fosse comes over and he kind of whispers in my ear and he says, listen, it would be really great if you could get hard, and walked away. And I was like, what? And I was like so freaked out and felt like this failure. And I was, and later on I had people say, yeah, that's the kind of stuff he would do. He wanted you to be freaked out. That was sort of an interesting experience, and kind of apparently often part of his work way, ways of dealing with people is that he would play mental games and stuff to get people into whatever state he felt they needed to be in. So that was sort of an interesting, touch of, and I'm sure it was effective, but it was also a little bit fucked up. Not, I went on to be fine. It didn't cause any deep lifelong scarring, but I heard some stories about stuff where it really kind of crossed the line in terms of stuff like that he would do with people. So, so that was sort of the other side of it that I also got to experience. But the other thing I remember being very interesting was that he directed at least me. And again, I have no idea that if he was like this with other actors or older actors or whatever, but it was like being directed by a choreographer, even in the acting scenes. He was very, very specific about my body and body language, and not very specific about the emotions of the scene or line readings or, he was sort of fine with me playing the scene however I wanted, but he was very like, okay, on this word, I want you to put your two fingers on the top of the hat and then hold them there for 2 beats and then tap it twice. It was very interesting. So it was very like dance stuff, but he would never say, oh, could you be more shy, or could you be, could you make it more internal or more external? Or I don't remember almost any directions like that. It was all about, oh, maybe cross your legs like 3 words later. And so it was kind of fascinating because it was like, I was literally doing this dance physically that he was completely creating. And then I could act it sort of how I wanted, but I had to get those dance steps right, which was pretty interesting. And I probably would have hated it if it wasn't somebody that I had a huge admiration for. But given that I thought he was a genius, and given that, people in his movies were always great, I was like, sure, whatever you wanted is fine. But if a director I didn't have that sense of admiration for had been that hyper specific physically, I think I probably would have felt a little bit, overwhelmed and locked in, and probably would have been more likely to say, hey, wait a minute, this is getting crazy. But, it was Bob Fosse. So it was like, dude, you want me to stand on my head? I'll stand on my head. Sure. Whatever. So those were, I guess, the sort of the biggest memories that I, when I was thinking about it, knowing I was going to talk to you. And those are the things that I remember most. But feel free to ask other questions, because those are just the ones that came back up when I was looking back at it.
You're an actor who is playing a dancer as opposed to him hiring a dancer and having them act. And I'm curious, what do you think it was about you or your audition that really caught his eye and had him cast you in that role?
You never know, because it wasn't like he didn't explain it to me. And I think he was sort of surprised that he cast me. Although even when I just did the audition, I mean, he was saying, don't worry about the dancing, we'll make that. I mean, he kind of was sort of telling me I had the job when I auditioned. All I can imagine is that there was just some quality in my quality that he saw that he felt, first of all, would be a good match for Roy, which obviously was a key thing with that part, whether it was physicality or whatever. In some way, he felt like that would make sense, that there was something about my vulnerability and age. And I mean, I was very young, and I do know that when I went into audition, I think the other people I saw there were like older than I was. So maybe the fact that I really was like 17 and not like 23 playing young might have appealed to him. Through most of my years as an actor, very rarely would somebody say, well, here's why I hired you. So you don't, as an actor, it's an odd thing. You don't really know what it is. You're happy that you got the job, but very, very rarely do you have a sense of, oh, this is what it was that convinced them, which is funny. I wonder, probably people who've worked for me as an actor felt the same thing. I'm thinking about people I've hired. And yeah, I don't often tell actors, oh, I hired you because you had this. It seems to only come up if there's something that I want them not to lose, and I had that same thing with I might have a director say, when you auditioned, I fell in love with this quality, so just be careful not to lose that element. But short of that, it's funny. I think probably most actors most of the time have no idea why they got a job.
That final scene that you were there for, I mean, you do get a close-up, though it's a little tough to tell that it's you. I mean, are we supposed to know, like, this is young Joe seeing old Joe as he's about to go?
I agree. I've had other people say, I sort of thought that was you, but I wasn't sure. So clearly, in the end, the effect was a little confusing or not hyper clear. You're not the only person who's ever said that by a long shot. Whether that was Fosse's intention, I have no idea. I mean, again, that was not something he spoke to. So whether he liked that it was ambiguous, certainly it's a really quick shot. So it's not like your brain has a lot of time to reset. And you haven't seen me at that point for an hour of the film. So it's not surprising that it would be confusing. It seems like, but I mean, I'd love to know that, it's 8 trillion things. I'd love to know what was in their heads. And, he and Alan Heim, and when they were working on stuff. And I think it's possible that he liked the idea that it was sort of subliminal. And if people got it, they got it. And if they didn't, they didn't. But I think that more because I feel like that's how a lot of the film seems to work to me, that a lot of things are kind of like sort of there, but they're not very literally spelled out, and it's one of those movies. And one of the things I love about it as a film goer is I love movies where every time you see it, you notice something new. And I feel like that's definitely one of those movies. It may well have been sort of intentionally like, let's not sit on this shot.
Did you call upon any of those experiences working for Fosse when you did The Singing Detective?
Yes, because I see myself as about his level of genius when it comes to dancing and choreography.
Wow. No ego whatsoever.
It was no, I mean, obviously, of course I was affected by it, but I was more affected by the fact that I was a huge admirer even than the fact that I had worked on the movie. It wasn't like there was something I saw on the set that I directly applied to Singing Detective for a number of reasons. I mean, the difference between, a very large budgeted studio film and a little tiny weird art movie where part of the point that even Dennis Potter talked to is that the numbers shouldn't be too slick and they should be kind of messy, and that they're somebody's fantasy of being in a musical. They're not a musical. And, so there was a lot of things that were so different inherently in it, so that it wasn't possible to sort of even try to do that, nor would it have, I think, been appropriate kind of amazing choreography and stuff that he did. That said, clearly, I mean, I loved his stuff. And when I talked to the choreographers, we talked about Fosse, and we talked about, some of the hospital numbers, and the surrealness of the dancing. And we even used Sandra Bergman, who was the lead in the Take Off With Us number. She's actually in Singing Detective in the number where on the Hop number where it's kind of a medical fantasy. You only see her briefly, but there was definitely a little homage thing going on there, which was really fun. And she was super sweet. And, we had her like, a very Fosse-ish sort of Merry Widow sort of lingerie thing with a hypodermic and she still looked amazing. I mean, it was like, many years later, but she was still like in incredible shape and a wonderful dancer. So that was fun, and that was a little nod to Fosse. Not that I expected anybody in the world to ever notice it. It was just that the choreographers happened to know her, and it was actually their idea. I can't take credit for it. They said, "What would you think of using her for this?" I was like, "If she would want to do it, I'd be so honored and thrilled." And it was really sort of fun, and she was so nice. I mean, it was only she was only there for like a day, but she was just great. In fact, my overall, I mean, I will say my respect for dancers directing a film that had musical numbers grew insanely. I mean, you couldn't tell it so much around Fosse because Fosse was so much the center of attention on the set. So I didn't think about the dancers as much. But doing a film where you're working with dancers, the discipline and the humor and the fact that they were able to do take after take after take of these really physically demanding things where they're picking each other up and tossing themselves in the air and like, I would be like, "Are you guys okay? Can you keep doing this?" And they're like, "Oh, this is what we do." And I thought they were like the most amazing people. And they seemed to all be in incredibly good moods all the time. And, and we were this little low budget film and nobody was getting paid that much money. And they were just like the best. I was just, I understand why people want to work with dancers because it's people who do that, I think, bring a purity of passion to it. Very few dancers become famous for being dancers. Most of them just do their work, and yet they bring everything to it. And so that was something I probably missed a little bit, even when I was doing all that jazz. So I was busy acting and I wasn't thinking about it. And again, that world was so around Fosse that I wasn't stopping and thinking about what the dancers were doing. But when I got to be in that position with dancers, I was like, wow, okay, you guys are the best. That was a cool thing to finally come to realize later in life, but it was a nice thing to. And now whenever I see like a musical or whatever, I'm just like, yeah, okay, it's all amazing to me. And they had to do this 80 times and, they had to learn this all. And it's kind of an amazing thing.
How close was Roy Scheider to Bob Fosse, do you think, as far as the performance?
I thought Roy did an amazing job of getting what seemed to be Fosse's essence as a presence. I didn't know either of them super well, even though I'd done Jaws 2 with Roy. It wasn't like we had a lot of stuff together. But Roy was very friendly and approachable, and we chatted a certain amount. And first of all, the body language stuff was incredible. And I don't know if Fosse pushed him to do that or that was what he chose to do, because I wasn't around for those conversations. But watching them standing together, like on the set, like Roy just was Bob in terms of body. I mean, in terms of the way he walked, the way he moved, the way he held a cigarette, it was freaky. I mean, when the two of them were near each other, it was like, because they don't really look that much alike. Their essence was, and that was, I thought, a remarkable thing that Roy pulled off because, again, Roy is not primarily a dancer. I think he had some dance training, but I don't think it was what he'd done much in his career. And yet he really moved like Fosse. And if you watch him in the film, the way he walks, the way he holds himself, the way, it was as if he was somebody who'd been working with his body primarily his whole life. So that was really remarkable to me. And I don't know how that evolved. I don't know what the conversations were as they were working on the character. And then Fosse also had his weird thing where he was insisting that the character wasn't him, which was a little bizarre. He was very serious about it. He was very it's not me. It's not me. And it's like, okay. But then clearly it was him and he was dressing, Roy like him. So it was a little bit schizophrenic on that level, and I thought at first that when I'd heard some of that, I thought, oh, well, he's just saying that because he wanted to have some freedom to not have to. But even when I talked to him about it, and about playing the young him, he was like, well, it's not me. He's like, I mean, this happened to me, but this isn't me. It was very strange and interesting. And again, I wished I had been older and more comfortable engaging him in even deeper, longer conversations about that stuff. I will say that in terms of him and Roy, when I was around for that last Bye Bye Life number, there was a real ease and flow that they had with each other. I mean, it wasn't very jokey. It wasn't like a fun, light set because that didn't seem to be the energy that Fosse put off. He was very focused, very intense. Not mean or angry. I don't think I ever heard him yell but he's not like somebody who's like hanging out and like quipping and he's kind of really focused. And so was Roy. Their conversation seemed very flowing. There was very little conflict. There was very little, they sort of seemed to really have what they were doing down. And he would sort of say just one or two little things to Roy, and you'd see Roy really make an interesting adjustment coming out of that, or adjust how he was doing a dance move. But it was very efficient and very focused. And it was like a quiet set. It was like, there was that kind of intensity to it. It wasn't like it wasn't like between takes that everybody started talking a ton. Everybody was kind of like really just there. And Fosse, I think, had that kind of energy. I think he felt like the maestro was there and people kind of paid attention. It wasn't a lot of people just drifting away.
I was talking to Alan Heim last night, and he was just saying that he got into trouble quite a few times because he would say, when you do this, and he meant the Roy Scheider character, he meant Joe Gideon, and Fosse was getting really angry at him about that.
Interesting. Yeah, so it obviously was really deep for him. Clearly was him. I mean, everything about it and everything. And if he really wanted to send that message, he could have dressed Roy different. He could have not had Roy wear the hair and beard thing exactly the way he did. It's a weird thing that he did everything he could to underline the connection, and then would get really pissy about it and says there's no connection. And I don't. Yeah, Alan Heim obviously be a great source, because they I'm sure they worked so closely and so intensely for so long that probably more than anybody, he'd really be able to talk about what that process was, because so much of Fosse's films are about editing for me. I mean, they're some of the best edited movies I can think of. And I think Alan did an incredible job. And clearly that was a real process in the film. So, as much as it was a great script, when you saw the final movie, you saw how much of it they found in the way they constructed it. So I'm sure that, Alan would be, I'm glad you got to him, because I look forward to hearing what he had to say, because really probably no other person was as important to that movie other than Fosse himself, I think.
I know, obviously, that movies aren't shot chronologically, but how long of a time was there between when you're doing Young Joe and when you're back there at the end? And was that in that order?
It was in that order. I don't think they were going strictly chronologically, but they did. I do think the Bye Bye Life number was near the end, if not the end, of the shooting schedule. Whether that was an artistic choice because they wanted to build to it, or just a happenstance of production, I don't know. But it definitely was. I think the nightclub part of it, where I was with the strippers, was early in the schedule, and the other was late in the schedule. So there was a pretty big gap. There was a couple of months, I think, between doing the two. And I actually it wasn't in the script that Young Joe was in that audience. So I actually thought I was done. That was actually a wonderful surprise when I got this call saying, do you want to come out? And I think they said it was like for a day to be in the audience. And I was like, well, sure, of course. And then I was there like 2 weeks, which was wonderful, because it was, it was Fosse, and it was this incredible musical number. And I just got to sit there and watch and hang out with, Lithgow and all the actors in the show. That was a wonderful bonus prize that I didn't expect and didn't see coming.
Keith, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for these stories about all that jazz. I really appreciate this.
Well, I hope it's helpful. I'll look forward to seeing, or hearing a piece when it's all done. And yeah, it's just always great. It's just always great to hear from you. And it's always fun to talk to somebody else who loves movies so much. So, I'm happy to do it.
Where did you even grow up at?
I was born in Weirton, West Virginia, and grew up in Pittsburgh. And I started wanting to get out of Pittsburgh around the time I was 9. Finally managed to when I was 16. I kept imagining ways to run away or get away. Finally, I managed to finish high school and persuade my parents to let me audition for Juilliard as a dancer, because I wanted to be a ballet dancer. That was my big goal. And it was going to be a preliminary audition, like for the next year. But as I got all my classes done, I said, well, great, let me change this to a real audition. And they went, oh, okay. And then when I got in as a dancer, they went, oh, she got in, I guess she has to go. So I got an apartment in New York. Juilliard didn't have dorms. at 16. I didn't like Juilliard because they wanted me to be a modern dancer. I wanted to be a ballet dancer. So I studied ballet on the side with American Ballet Theater and all the different kinds of dance you can do in New York City. And I turned 21 and realized that I was too old. I was over the hill. My career was over. I wasn't in a major ballet company. I hadn't done anything with my life. It was all over for me. And a wonderful voice teacher that someone had, forced me to take lessons from said, okay, you've got to get into a profession where you're younger. Go by backstage and circle all of the auditions that you're right for, as a chorus dancer. And before you come back next week, I want you to go to all of them, or don't come back. Something like that. Some tough love thing. And so I went, all right. And I think the first audition I went to was a bus and truck tour of Seesaw, directed by Tommy Tune. And I got in. I went, oh, that's where I'm supposed to be, I guess. And I did chorus stuff for a while and got into Chorus Line, which was like the big casino for dancers and actors and dancers / actors in New York. So I got into the New York company. I had auditioned previously and gotten cut, but after a while of being on the road, and then I think I got into Pal Joey on Broadway, auditioned again, and they called me up and they said, well, we would like you to understudy for Sheila. That's the part I was trying out for, the tall, gorgeous, Can the Adults Smoke, Kelly Bishop role. And they said, but we'd like you to go to England. And I went, no. And I hung up and I went, oh my God, what did I do? I called back and I said, okay, well, we would like you to understudy Sheila in the New York company. And I went, yes. Yes, at last. Yes, okay, I can do that. So I was learning Sheila and being myself, which is sort of a, walking into walls type person. And the woman who was doing Christine, I really, the married couple, I really couldn't sing. She wanted to leave, Cookie Vasquez, and she wanted to go back to Los Angeles, where she was from. And they said, would you like to try out for a place on the line? And I went, oh, yeah. And I did that. And they went, okay, you're in. And I said, but I still want to understudy Sheila. I went, all right. So I played Christine and understudied Sheila when Sheila was gone for about 2.5 years. And then in the middle of that, all that jazz came up. So a chorus line is how I got an agent in New York, finally. I'd been talking to this agent, and when I got into chorus line, I said, hey, would you negotiate my contract for me? And she went, yeah, and take 10% for every week? Yes. No worries. She sent me up actually for Chicago. I'd always wanted to be a Fosse dancer. That was my big dream on Broadway. And I'd auditioned for Pippin and kind of almost gotten in. And they said, well, you're just not quite sharp enough. And then Chicago, and then I'd gotten cut at the end of that after I sang. And God, I love all of Fosse's choreography and direction and, stuff. So Chicago was going on a national tour, and I got an audition for Roxy. And got down to me and Pennyworth. We both went into the audition, and we worked with Bob directly on Roxy's monologue. And oh my God, I just fell in love with working with him. I had this physical desire to work with him as a director and be directed by him. It was just, I'd never had that kind of experience before, working with someone, just the stuff that he did with working with me with the monologue. So when she got it, I was devastated, but I thought, well, at least he knows who I am. I was in the studio with him for half an hour, and he saw me act and sing and dance, so he knows me. Well, he didn't remember me. He was lucky if he remembered all of the women that he slept with, which he probably didn't. He was like this pan god of New York theater. He just ran around, sleeping with girls here and there. And everybody kind of loved him and, worshipped him. A pan god, basically. Absolutely in rut all the time. And really, really, really talented. So this wonderful thing, I think the wonderful thing about New York is if you're very talented, it doesn't matter. You can get away with whatever you want to get away with. I mean, not so much now, I guess. Me Too is a good thing, really overdue. But at least at that time in the 70s, when it was a free-for-all anyway, if you were a genius talent, that was enough. So there he was, and I was like, okay, well, he knows me, and I'm in. And I asked my agent to submit me for All That Jazz, and she did, and he didn't call me in. So I went, oh, all right. I knew, I trusted him to know what he wanted in a role. So I went, okay, I'm not right. And then a friend of mine who had been in a chorus line, Jo Sparrows, she was the youngest member of the line. I think she was 17 or 18, said, hey, I'm going to go to the open call for dancers across the street at the Palace Theater. Can I use your dressing room? She had left the show, and she said, can I use your dressing room to get ready? And I went, oh, yeah, because we were at the Schubert. And she said, you should come. And I went, no, I don't want to be in the chorus. I don't want to be a dancer. I'm acting now. And she said, yeah, but, and then she told me the story about, Dustin Hoffman going to audition for Mike Nichols for some Broadway show. And it was a singing part, and he didn't sing, but he went anyway. And then Mike Nichols discovered him and put him in The Graduate and, started his whole career. She said, you should come. All right. So, and then at the end, all the auditions after being in a chorus line were so surreal because chorus line was all about auditioning and then, standing on a line and being chosen. So there I was. I auditioned. I got through the dance, which was amazing to me because I was like, oh, I'm a Fosse dancer now. So standing on the line, and unbeknownst to me, Vicki Stein, Bob's dear secretary, said to him, that's Deborah Geffner. And he went, who? She told me later. And she said, we had her in for Roxy. She's very good. You liked her. And he went, oh. So I stayed as, one of the, I was kept as a chorus person, so one of the who were rehearsing in the big rehearsal room and all those scenes. And then they called me back to say, would you audition for this part that I had, been up for and not auditioned for? And he had called in Sandal Bergman and Vicki Fredericks, who were people he knew and who had been, I think they were in dancing already. And Bob Fosse had this terrific hatred, I would say, for Michael Bennett. Rivalry. He just couldn't stand that, Michael Bennett got all of these awards for chorus line. He just hated that. Even in dancing, the first people come out and they say, this is a show where we don't talk about dancing, we just dance. His response to it was a direct response to chorus line. So he just hated Michael. So Sandal, he had gotten Sandal and Vicki from a chorus line, and they'd gone into dance, and they had also been in Pippin, and they were Fosse chorus dancers from way back. So I was up against them. I didn't know that. I went to read for him, and he said, "You're very good," but he said, "I'm going to call you back for a screen test." But he said, wear something form-fitted, because I was wearing it was the 80s, and we were wearing like these blousey things. So I was in the height of fashion. And he said, my girlfriend, Jessica Lange, wears these things too. She has this beautiful figure. I want to be able to see your figure in the screen test. So I went crazy, trying to figure something out. And got a bathrobe and I had it tailored, and then I know I was like, what do I wear that's form-fitting? Because it was a scene. It was an audition scene. I got it. Vicki Stein again got me my screen test. She was so sweet and got it for me, and so I have it up on my website. But I ended up wearing this flannel shirt of my father's, and just underwear, and it was a scene in bed talking to Joey when he goes into the hospital, and the conceit of this scene is that I'm calling him in the hospital and telling him all the things that went on that you actually see in the movie.
Everybody thought the book reading was terrific. I never saw such enthusiasm. Hold on a second. Wait a second, John. Did Audrey tell you what happened after lunch? After you left? It was awful, like a wave. People just staring like zombies. First Jonesy made this speech saying how the show might have to be postponed probably for about 4 months. Oh, but he was real sweet about it. Telling the kids how management would try to find us temporary jobs, even lend us money. And then Audrey made this cute, really cute speech. Real up, saying how you were making jokes in the hospital. Oh, and then Paul Dan jumped up and said he had a great idea for a new number called Hospital Hop.
It was a really nice phone scene. I was going to do this screen test. Then he postponed it because Richard Dreyfuss left the movie over artistic differences. Richard Dreyfuss had just won the Oscar for The Goodbye Girl. And so he was an actor. And he started rehearsing with Bob, and Bob was rehearsing him the way he rehearsed everyone, which was choreographing you down to the last detail. He really was a control freak, but the thing was, he was so good that if you followed everything he said, he would tell you what to do with your finger, tap your finger on the window. And these little things, these little details were so well observed that if you just followed it, if you just did it and made it honest and real, you couldn't go wrong. He was better than almost everyone else that he was working with. If you go to a gathering of people who have worked with Bob, the one thing they will say is he made everyone look better than they were. And that's Giuseppe Rotuno, his cinematographer, who was Fellini's cinematographer, will say that. His AD, his people who did the music, the costume designer, everything he touched, he made the people look better than they were, really better than they were, because he just cared so much. Anyway, this really didn't sit well with Richard Dreyfuss. He knew how to act, and that's not how you direct an actor. So he quit. He was on the line because he had broken his contract. He was on the line for tens of thousands of dollars a day. He called up, Roy Scheider told me this story later. He called up Roy and said, okay, I've done it. Can you bail me out? Will you audition and take this job? If you're offered, because I know you'd be good in it. And Roy was actually a much better choice for it because he had this athletic physique and he was willing to work with Bob, and very easy person to work with. Very, very lovely man, very nice. And, the kind of man that takes steps 2, 3 at a time. And all the policemen around New York loved him because of the French connection. And they go, hey, Roy. They figured he was one of them. And just a guy. Just a real nice guy. Easy to talk to. So he took it. So in the meantime, that's what delayed my screen test for a couple of weeks. Naturally, I got sick and got bronchitis. And the nerves, I was all ready to do this. And I had the scene all memorized and, ready to go. And then, okay, we're waiting. I got really sick, couldn't breathe. And I did it once, and he said, okay, can you do it faster? And I was like, yes, I can. I thought to myself, yes, if I can breathe. And I was working with Bob, and you can hear his voice on the screen test. And I did it through just, as quickly as I could. And he said, okay, that was very good. That was much better. And then the next thing I heard was from Vicky Stein. He loves you, but he wants to see you again. He wants to see if you can do the dancing. And I was like, okay. It was like a woman trying on a dress for an important occasion. And I was the dress. The dress can't have feelings. It's not like, oh my God, he doesn't like me. It's just like, no, he has to try me on again and see if he wants the blue or the green. See if it really fits. See if this is the right one. Strikes the right tone. So I went in and I did his combination. It's the first combination that you see in All That Jazz. It's when they're doing the on Broadway scene, and it's like a step and to the side and click, and step to the side and click, and has a turn in it. And you turn and you go into a lunge and click and cock your head. I did that, did it really well. And I had on a strappy leotard with straps, skimpy, because everyone will tell you, every one of Bob's dancers will tell you, when they heard he was coming to rehearsal, the leg warmers would come off, the pants would come off, they would hike their leotards up, up above their butts, they'd pin it down in the front, because he loved seeing beautiful women and he wanted to see everything full out. He hated stuff covering your body. So I had an inkling of this. So I was wearing this heels, tights, and the skimpy leotard. So when I did this final lunge and then cocked my head to the side, my boob slipped out. And I went, whoops. So I will never know if that got me the job or not. So he said, okay, you're a good dancer. And he said, could you do this scene? And it was the scene from the movie where Victoria breaks down and cries. Not a good dancer, And I read it over and I went, oh my God, she cries at the end? No, I had never cried before on cue. And so I thought, what the heck am I going to do? And I just thought to myself, what if I got all the way through this and then didn't get the part? And that did it. And right on cue, in the middle of the thing, I burst into tears. And he was doing the scene with me. And I finished and he said, you cry easily, don't you? And I went, yeah. And then the next thing I heard was that I'd gotten it. But don't mess up your chances by asking for billing, because he's going to put the billing, where he wants it. Don't mess up your chances by asking for extra money, because he's going to give you SAG minimum. But also, I was hired for the entire shoot of the movie, which was like this amazing 6 months shoot and went on and on. And I don't know if you know the stories about All That Jazz, but in the middle, Warner Brothers that sold it to Columbia, or Columbia that sold it to Warner Brothers.
I want to say it was Columbia sold it to Warner Brothers, because I think it ended up coming out as a Warner Brothers picture.
So in the middle, he was going on and he was like, I need more time. And the studio wanted to pull the plug, and he put it together. I don't know the details, but I think he put some scenes together and shopped it over to Warner Brothers, and they said, oh yeah, we'll do this. So they took it over and he was able to finish it the way he wanted. I was devastated when I read the script and I found out that my audition scene was not in the script. Not in my second audition scene, the one where I broke down and cried was, but the screen test scene, wasn't in it. It was like after the rehearsals when Joey goes into the hospital, I felt like when I saw the movie, the rough cut of it, the screening, and he's so like his character. Before the screening, he said, well, the color correction isn't in, and, the sound isn't right. And he just laughed. He was always so down on himself. If you read Sammy's book called Fosse, it was a wonderful book. He did interviews with everyone. It really gets the flavor of how hard he was on himself and how much he just didn't live up to his own high standards, even though in so many ways he did. But his standards were so much higher.
Like anyone else, I'm afraid of failure, although I don't think that's the major thing. And afraid that the ideas that I have, I don't have the talent to execute. I would like to do better things, better quality things, more important things, and at the same time there's a fear that I don't have the equipment, the talent, the intelligence to bring them off.
You still have that fear, having proven and overcome that question so many times? Cabaret, Lenny, all that jazz, and Sweet Charity.
I don't know how it works on other people, but it's just, yes, I do. You know, like Chaplin said, all of us are amateurs. None of us live long enough to be anything else but.
Back to when I saw the screening of the movie, my parents came up and we were all invited to the screening. And I just disappeared after the first half of the movie. I felt like, I became a minor character. As soon as he got into the hospital, everyone else was in the hospital scenes, dancing and everything. And, somehow he had this vision of Victoria as soft-hearted and crying, not one of the dancers who were partying and, celebrating with him. But I just disappeared. I got so upset. I, came back home and just sat on my sink and ate a whole pint of coffee Haagen-Dazs ice cream. It was like it drowned my sorrows because I really thought I had a major role in the movie. And seeing it, I was like, no, I don't. But it was a major role. It was wonderful, and it was, just an honor to be in it, an honor to be on set with him. He was always working the hardest of anyone on set. I would watch him, and I would see him sitting there. It looked like he was doing nothing for a second, but I mean, in his mind, he was like going 4 or 5 steps ahead, and waiting. And there was a tension on that set that I had never experienced after. It was the first movie I ever did. I thought, oh my God, it's always like this. It was like everyone waiting on him and waiting for his movies or hurry up and wait for the tech to get done. So we're all standing there waiting, and then we would just hear the Wolfgang Gladys, the first AD, go, okay, come on, how soon are, how close are we? Because it was just, it was maddening, but he wanted it right. And Giuseppe Rotuno wanted it right. He would, focus each light the way he wanted it. And it was beautiful, beautiful film. But the tension, the amount of tension and the amount of nerves and of wanting to get it right, I've never seen before or since. Any dancer that works with him will also tell you that he wants to see it full out. If he's rehearsing, if he's, riding camera on a shot, he wants to see it full out. Otherwise, he can't figure out how it's going to look. So you're dancing full out, and then he rides the shot again, and you do it again, full out. And again, you do it full out. And by the time you get to the actual shot, you're just exhausted. You're ready to drop. But the thing is, it meant so much to him. There's a word for it, but it meant so much that it means so much to you. And that was the kind of effort that he was able to call forth from people. For example, in the Take Off With Us number, where Sandal is up on the scaffolding and everybody's, dancing all around her, and she's taken her clothes off, and then he wanted her to just fall off the scaffolding into the arms of the guys below. It's like a 6-foot scaffolding. Well, 6 foot, it's like a 5-foot scaffolding platform where she was. And he said, okay. And he didn't ask her to try it. He went up there with his cigarette in his mouth. He said, okay, to the guys, catch me. And they're all like, ah! And he did it. And he said, okay, that. So once he's done it with a cigarette in his mouth, you can't say, oh, that's too dangerous. I just showed you. I just did it for you. And he wouldn't ask anyone to do anything that he wouldn't do himself either. I mean, he was that kind of dancer and person and choreographer. But he did manipulate when Elizabeth Foldy and what's her name, who played Audrey, the wonderful actor,
Leland Palmer. They
were sitting in the back row watching the audition scene, on Broadway. And he goes back. She says, you're supposed to have her this weekend. And he goes, oh, I can't. I'm sorry. Elizabeth, his daughter in the film said, oh, that's all right. And he wanted her to cry. So he had someone tell her that he was going to die. But it was for the movie. I guess someone told her that he was fine afterwards. I don't know, but I heard that. Then this wonderful scene where I burst into tears, when I'm dancing and he's, lay back, Victoria, lay back, yelling at me. So we'd been rehearsing. We rehearsed the dance number for about 6 weeks before we even started filming. The dancers got together and it just whipped us into shape. So we became this cohesive group, and we were so in shape, and we were, when we did, the first things that we did were those, the first things we filmed were those numbers. So by the time we got to the Palace Theater and did the on Broadway audition scene, his dancers actually were in much better shape than the other dancers, so that's verisimilitude. And we knew this, we knew the combinations, we knew all the stuff. We did all of the Take Off With Us number. And then we filmed my bit where we're rehearsing, and he yelled at me. And I found him somewhere on set on this cavernous stage in New York City. And I said, so, Bob, what would you like me to do? How would you like me to be not so good? Or, what would you like me to do to not be good? And he looked at me with a cigarette in his mouth. He went, he would, stand and cough and squint one eye, and he'd go, just dance your best. That'll be bad enough. He didn't say, he didn't add, that'll be bad enough. He knew that with the right angles, and, he knew he could make anyone look good or look bad. I didn't get that at the time. I know that now. Looking back at it, I can see that he had, like I said, hated Michael Bennett. He hated a chorus line, and I was so proud that I was in a chorus line because, it was there for 2 years already, and, we came out of the stage door, and there would be 24 people lined up asking for our autographs and saying, "Oh, I loved you the best. Christine was my favorite. You were so funny. Would you sign my autograph?" And we were Broadway stars, and, I kept asking him if he's seen me, and, did you see me in it? He went, no. After I actually got the part, he invited me out to dinner. There was one time we were at Patsy's, which was an Italian restaurant, and we came in, and there was a huge round table, and Michael was at it, Michael Bennett. And I was walking in with Bob Fosse feeling really good. He went up to the table, and he went right in back of Michael, and like you would clap someone on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Michael, how are you?" But instead of just clapping him on the shoulder, he clapped him on the shoulder and pushed him down so his face was almost in the plate. He went, "Hey, Michael, how are you?" I went, "Oh, good." And then we walked to our seat. I think it might have been that same dinner where it was because it was after the show. Someone came to our table. The two of us were talking about the part, about others, whatever. I don't remember what. But this woman came to the table, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. May I interrupt you?" And we both looked up, and here I am with Bob Fosse. And she looked at me, and she said, "Oh, you were so great tonight. May I have your autograph?" And she handed me a chorus line program. I said, "Oh, thank you so much. And what's your name?" Signed it and handed it back to her. And he said, "Wow, you were very gracious." It was very gracious of you. I thought, so he can see I'm good. I just wanted him to think I was still trying to impress him, like you do. We were back to doing this scene, and I was standing there, and the first lines that Roy would say are, "Okay, stand on your right foot, point your left toe, drop that shoulder. That's not too hard, is it?" Then Kathy Dobie would yell, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'd go into the dance. Anyway, right before we started it, when we were doing my close-up, he came up to me and he said, cigarette and it's hanging off his mouth. He said, "Oh, by the way, I did see you in a chorus line, and you stank." And he went, "Okay, action." I've got that look on his face, So he was wonderful, but it was, what a gift, right? Screws you up, but what a gift artistically. And we did the crying scene, and it was really good, I thought. And snot dripped out of my nose, and my friend Rima, who was one of the dancers, said, "Oh my God, my stomach was churning." It was such a hard scene to watch. So we finished it, and then someone came up and talked to him, and he was so mad. He goes, "Okay, we're going to do it again." The boom had dipped into the frame, and we had to do it all over again. If they had kept the take with the snot dripping out of my nose, I might have been famous like Jane Fonda and Clute. But anyway.
Were there many scenes that were shot that weren't used that you were in?
No, it was tightly organized by Wolfgang Gladys mostly, and he still has the shot list. The day out of days, what did you call it? He still has that in his house, and he it's amazing. It's like a 6 month day out of days. It's just incredible. And he said, that he's never been on a shoot that long, except Cabaret, of course, which he also did with him, which is an amazing, amazing movie. Every time I see it, God. And it's interesting, sometimes I watch All That Jazz in these screenings, we've got to reconstitute it. And sometimes Roy is really, really great. And sometimes I go, oh, that's kind of fake. But I notice as time goes on, he's been getting better. That's a really weird thing to say about a movie. But maybe it's the better quality restoration where you can see the nuances of his acting. But he was really good. He was really good.
You would go on to work with Fosse again in Star 80. How was that experience?
Really interesting. I had moved to Los Angeles with my boyfriend, who later became my husband, who later became the father of my 2 kids. Bob called me up just out of the blue, and he said, I'm in Los Angeles, and I have a part that I would like you to do. I said, wow, that would be great. Apparently, he was very unhappy during Star 80. And personally, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think he understood the story the way he understood Cabaret or All That Jazz or even Lenny, I think. I just don't think he understood a story where a guy would manipulate a woman in that way. I don't think he understood that particular relationship between Eric and Mariel. So he said, I want you for this scene. And I went, oh, that's great. And then he said, would you like to come over? And I said, oh, I can't. How did I say it? I don't remember it. He said, I'd love to see you. And I said something like, it was something, I can't come over. I can't do that. I'm not going to. When I got to set, he had put that dialogue. It wasn't exactly that dialogue, but he had put that dialogue in our scene. And I was with Gwen in a car, in the car show, and Eric Roberts was talking to us. And, he gave Gwen the line. She said, I'm not fucking for money. And then he gave me the line, she's not, but I am. And again, he choreographed. He said, look out the window when you're saying it, do that with your finger. He curled himself into the car. He was down. Eric was in the driver's seat. He was in the passenger, on the floor, on the passenger side, curled inside the seat where he could see everything and direct us so he could be a part of us. You know what I mean? So he wasn't the guy outside watching on the Video Village. He was one of the ones inside. He was one of the creative. He was part of the creative team, There's a subtle difference. And he was willing to just squeeze himself into the car and keep his head underneath the dashboard so they couldn't see him, from outside, so that he could direct everything minute to minute, second to second. So I was delighted to be, asked to do it. He said, and again, I'm calling you because I don't want to have to deal with agents. But of course, I called my agent, but it was like, this is the money. This is what I'm offering. But it was like, yeah, I'll work for you again. Yeah. I'm crazy about you. Anytime.
Have you ever worked with anybody like him since then?
No. No one to whom it meant so much. It was so essential that he just get it right. We went to Pace University. Was it Pace? Pace, where we went upstate New York for the final death scene, Bye Bye Love. He had us all up there, and he looked at the place the way they had it, and he went, no. And he redesigned it. He wanted it all Mylar, so that was his design. So we waited. We hung out for a couple of days while they redecorated it all in Mylar. Then he had 2 of the dancers from the chorus doing the heart, the pulmonary, or whatever, the what do you call this, ventricles of the heart? What Kathy Dobie and Anne Reinking eventually did. So he had them all set up. I won't say who it was. but two really good dancers. And they were doing it, and they'd learned the choreography. The costumes were all fitted on them. He wasn't satisfied with their dancing. He wasn't satisfied with what they could do. So he had his two best dancers, Kathy Dopey and Anne Ranking, do that. And they were sewn into those costumes. Once they got in those costumes, they couldn't pee. They had to be unstitched so they could go to the bathroom. And if you look at that choreography, I mean, it's unforgiving. It's so hard, and they're so good. They're so controlled. There's not a wobble. There's not a complaint. There's nothing. It's in service, it's in service to this genius. It's in service to the vision, and everyone was in service to the vision. And they had to get out of the costumes, get, made up for their parts when he runs around and he says goodbye to everyone. They had to get remade up, and all those living statues. Kenny Utz's one of the producers, she was one of the living statues, and those women were walking around, with silver faces and weird wigs. And then, oh God, there was a rogues gallery in the men's dressing room of John Lithgow. What an incredible guy! John Lithgow, David Margulies. Who was it? The producer. I think Anthony, William Lamessina, who played Jonesy, Max, Michael Tolan. They were all in the men's room, and they were all playing poker and, just shooting the shit and having the best time, But we were there for days. They were calling it POPA, Prison of the Performing Arts. And we had gone so long that I was actually back in a chorus line. I had gotten a leave of absence. This is another thing that pissed Bob off. He gave me the job, and I said, "Oh, but I don't want to leave the chorus line. I love my job." I asked the management if I could get a leave of absence, and they went, "No." And I somehow talked to Bob or told him. Anyway, his company called them, and suddenly, I had a 6-month leave of absence. And I got to come back to chorus line. So I was out there all day long, and then would take the car back, the limo back, and go straight to the show and do Christine. So right after the show ended, I went out to dinner one night, and I bit down on a fork and chipped a tooth. And I was so embarrassed. So the next night I went into a chorus line, and I did Christine, but I wouldn't smile because I didn't want everyone to see my chipped tooth. So a couple of weeks before that, Joe Papp had come. He was the head of the New York Shakespeare Festival, and he had said to me, I was doing great. He said, "Oh my God, you're the best Christine we've ever had. You're so wonderful." And then apparently Michael saw it the night that I chipped my tooth and wouldn't smile. The next day, I got the call that I was fired. Yeah, it was part of the chorus line experience. You weren't really you weren't really on the line unless you actually got fired. I mean, but after 2.5 years, I was okay. It wasn't okay with me. I was devastated. And he said, while you were away, the line has gotten younger and, you've gotten more mature. You would make a good Kathy. I actually called him up. I took my heart in my hands and called him and said, "Hey, what's going on?" They said, you've gotten more mature. The line has youthened around you, and Christine has to be one of the young people. I don't know whether that was bullshit. I don't know whether he wanted to bring in Chrissy Barker, who had been doing it in London and was tired and maybe was sleeping with Michael, because later on she became a Cassie. And usually people who slept with Michael became Cassie. He felt like Cassie should be a person who had slept with a famous choreographer. That was like one of the requirements for the role. So it could have been like a combination of Chrissy Barker. Could have been that the line really did get younger, because a lot of the people who were supposed to be older, Justin Ross had left and was replaced by Danny Weathers. And was it Danny Weathers? Anyway, someone younger. But, all the people who were supposed to be like the old gypsies, were younger, definitely were younger. Thinking back, he may have just hated me because of Bob.
What are you doing these days, especially being a working actress in lockdown?
A lot of voiceover, some dubbing for Netflix, dubbing into English. I love voiceover. I've got a home voiceover studio, and it's really fun. A lot of self-tapes. I would love to say, well, my career took off and, I don't have to audition anymore, but it's not true. I came out to Los Angeles and they were like, who? And you're not blonde. Did you notice you're not blonde? So it was kind of a shock. I came out because my boyfriend's then husband, who I married, got a great job out here in a law firm. I married an adult. I felt that one of us should be a grown-up. So I was out here and kind of went along and then had children, and that kind of stopped things for a while, even though I didn't mean for it to. But, I would have liked to keep going. So, I'm kind of back, and people go, oh, that jazz, you were wonderful. Oh, my God. That's an amazing, iconic movie and an iconic role, and I'm always so incredibly grateful. And I love and I honor being in that movie and having worked with Bob and having had a chance to be around him and understand, working at that level, that high level. And I always, when I did any movies, I always expected, I was always waiting for it to get hard. When will this be difficult? When will you ask me to do this the 17th time? Even the scene that I did with Roy in his apartment. Do you think I can be a movie star? You're looking at my nose, aren't you? And that where we're smoking. It's a perfect day. It's a perfect way to end a perfect day. That ends with Annie coming in and finding us in bed. So that one, we did this long shot, and it was, he wanted it to be stone, so there was camera movement and swooping, and he had tracks laid down in this apartment, and then the camera would bump. And so we really did this scene about 20 times for the camera. I want to know what you think. Do you think I could be a movie star? And, hold on and going to the stairway. And that was all sort of like one swooping take. And so we finally got the camera moved down, and we did it. And he came over to me with his cigarette hanging, and he, stood in front of me and coughed and like, just act better. I'm flattered that he thought I understood what act better meant, and that he thought I could, and that I'm kind of flattered that was his direction, because act better means I trust you to act better also. But for me, it was like, oh fuck, he doesn't like my acting. And he would stand in front of you with his cigarette and cough and cough and cough, and you would go, oh my God, please just don't die. Please, I'll do it. I'll do it better. I'll do anything you want. Just don't die. I'll do it. What do you want? What can I do for you? By the time he finished coughing, it was like, what? I think maybe he knew it. But I kept waiting for something to be that hard. And it just never was. It was like 4 takes, okay. Or 3 takes, or 1 take, that's good.
Well, Miss Geffner, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
This was awfully fun. Thank you for letting me talk about myself. I really appreciate it.
We're back and we're talking about all that jazz. Before I forget, I want to thank Lee Gambin for hooking me up with Mr. Heim and Ms. Geffner. If you're unfamiliar with Lee, he's the author of quite a few books you should read, including one about John Carpenter's Christine. He does a podcast for Diabolique magazine, a link to which I will publish in this week's show notes. So Bob Fosse had an unexpected return to the public eye in 2019 with an 8-part series called Fosse Verdon, which was over on the FX network, which was based in part on Sam Wasson's book on Fosse. I sat and watched all 8 parts. My God, Sam Rockwell and Michelle Williams, just fucking fantastic. I could not believe, I love Sam Rockwell. I loved him since the first time I've seen him. I'm trying to remember if that was maybe The Green Mile or maybe Galaxy Quest. Ever since he has come into the public sphere, I've just so enjoyed him.
Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. One of the lost treasures that people don't know about. Go rent it. Sam Rockwell Julia Roberts, George Clooney, the not really true story of Chuck Barris, the head of the Gong Show, who says he was a CIA hitman. It is genius. Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Go rent it.
It was so weird watching Fosse Verdon, and there's a part which is a reenactment of a scene that we see in All That Jazz, and I'm pointing to the character on screen and I'm saying, I interviewed that guy, not actually that guy there, but the guy who he represents. And it was like when they finally get to the All That Jazz section, I think it's like the 8th episode, and they've got the stand-in for Roy Scheider, and it is Lin-Manuel Miranda. And I'm just like, there's so many levels going on here as far as interpretation and who's playing who in real life versus fantasy. And we have that scene that the Roy Scheider stand-in saying to the Fosse stand-in, oh, this is an incredible rush to go up into the stands. Actually, I think that was in the Roy Scheider behind-the-scenes stuff when he was talking about how wonderful that feeling of going up into the audience and hugging all those people. And then he told Fosse to do it, and we have Fosse doing that and how exhilarated he is. But then we get that next moment, which is, okay, places everyone, we're going to start recording again. And all of a sudden the audience just goes right back to dead. And it's just like, wow, that was all fake enthusiasm. I love that moment. There were so many great moments in Fosse Verdon.
It's a really, really well done TV movie, or TV limited series, I think. I'm sorry. I have to say, as much as you love Sam Rockwell, I am at least as enthusiastic about Michelle Williams. I think she legitimately gives one of the best performances I have ever seen in that series. She becomes Gwen Verdon. If you've ever seen footage of Gwen Verdon or watched the movie Damn Yankees or seen anything Gwen Verdon's in, she has a very singular style. She has a very singular way of moving. And Michelle Williams, it's a transformation. There are very few performances that I think just transform. You see people like Albert Finney doing Hercule Poirot or something where you literally can't see the actor anymore. Or, I can't even think of other, performances that are just that. Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood, maybe, or Lincoln. She is that good in this. And certainly it's interesting because, even though I knew the bullet points of Fosse's life and Fosse's relationship with Gwen Verdon and how they were, kind of mutual artists with each other, they played off each other and made each other's work better. I didn't know a lot of that stuff. And, being a huge fan of Fosse's work, certainly, it was really inspiring and instructive to see be made that way. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about, the difference between Fosse and Joe Gideon. You watch that limited run series, like that is not Joe Gideon, that guy. That is very, very, very fundamentally wired differently man than the guy that he kind of made himself in All That Jazz.
I was most impressed with Michelle Williams' voice as Verdon. I have heard interviews and seen interviews with Gwen Verdon before, and she captured that vocal performance so well.
She blew my mind. I did just see her as Gwen Verdon. There were times with, Rockwell was brilliant, but there's times that I saw Rockwell there and in the vocal inflections. I think that it's harder to be Bob Fosse just because he doesn't have as distinct a speaking style as Gwen Verdon does. But, Michelle Williams just was incredible. And also just even her movement. And there was a bit of that. I think there was one dance scene.
It was from Dan Yankees. It was who put something when they do the mambo, that whole bit. But she also had more to work with, though. She did, because the character of Gwen Verdon over that series did develop. And we're going back to narrative arcs again. She had an arc. She had a serious arc. Fosse, did he have an arc? It's somewhat, something of it, but not, mostly he stubbornly kind of stayed himself. He stubbornly kind of didn't want to address his own faults or grow past them. Which I guess is a characteristic, and you can kind of, say that, but you know, when you're looking at a narrative, when you're looking at characters, you look to, you know, characters to develop. You look for them to change and make decisions. And I mean, she did. I mean, Gwen Verdon did. Fosse, at least in this rendition, did not so much.
Well, she had like this 15-year thing of buying the rights for Chicago. You heard about it and you saw little moments in this, but you didn't really get to that until like the 7th episode. And then it becomes like the thing and goes into the 8th episode. And yeah, it is this arc that you're talking about where we see little seeds of it being planted. And I do have to say that that Fosse Verdon is a really good double feature with All That Jazz because it is cut similarly in that we are moving through time and we're jumping from year to year to year. And I really like that is the way that it's put together. Being a fan of All That Jazz and watching it a few times and then watching Fosse Verdon, I was like, oh, well, this makes total sense.
Yeah, it's clear that they watched All That Jazz many, many, many times. And I will criticize the use of that technique in that TV series, the limited series, maybe a little bit, maybe mildly. It was maybe a little too much sometimes. There were a few times where I could have used a little more linearity. Maybe it's just because it was so much longer than a feature film, you know, like it gets a little exhausting. But I mean, overall, it's very clear that everybody involved in that project were so loving toward these two artists, and so deeply committed to telling their stories and the story of their relationship together in a respectful and loving and entertaining way.
The look of it was incredible. I agree. First of all, what you were saying, Mike, to watch All That Jazz, if anyone had the wherewithal to just watch all That Jazz, go back, watch the whole of the series, which is only 8 episodes, and then watch All That Jazz again, I think is a really interesting exercise, and to see how your perception changes of All That Jazz after watching the Fosse Verdon, but also in seeing a series that was made, a limited series that was made now compared to All That Jazz made released in 1979. You see the style and echoing the same stylistic things, right? There was a digital perfection about Fosse Verdon. I mean, Fosse Verdon looks incredible. The production design's gorgeous. Those beautiful, like the apartments, the play on, surprisingly, I think apartments and housing design plays a massive role in films and is probably underrated in a lot of ways. Like there was a lot of Gwen Verdon's, I felt, personality in her amazing apartment. And then when Fosse went out by himself and his different abodes, you could get a lot of his personality from that as well. But you could see how I don't think Fosse would work in a digital age. I couldn't imagine Bob Fosse directing now a film in digital. He's just film sensibility and the film grain seems to work so well for him.
Oh, no, I would fight you on that. I don't... Listen. No, I would. I think that, like, you know, when you get to real creatives and directors, Look, I think that celluloid is a lovely, lovely acquisition medium. You don't generally finish on celluloid. There's always a digital intermediary process. Unless you're Chris Nolan, I think he did Dunkirk entirely chemically, but that is very much the exception. I don't think any major film or most minor films have been finished entirely without a digital step. For 20 years or something. What we're talking about is an acquisition format. What we're talking about is literally like acquiring the shots on the day with film running through the camera or a digital sensor. Now, you can do miraculous things with digital sensors. You can make it look more like celluloid. You can make it look less like celluloid. You can make it look like a hybrid. But the one thing you do get from working in digital, and most major directors do work in digital. I'm not talking about Chris Nolan or Quentin Tarantino. There are always holdouts. But generally speaking, digital doesn't have to look like that early digital look. Digital got a bad name because around 2000, we had the advent of HD and everything looked like the worst sections of Collateral, which I think is actually very stylistic and really works for that film. But, when you're shooting a film that's not supposed to look like that, and it looks like that, then it's an issue. You look at the pissy behavior of some of the critics when Michael Mann, tried to do something really outside the box with a movie that is highly underrated, Miami Vice. Yeah, I don't care. You can yell at me on Twitter. It's true. So I think Bob Fosse could have probably adapted. I don't know if he'd want to. He'd probably be in his 90s now, I think, or something like that. But I think that, if you're an artist and you're really deeply committed to it, it's not about the mechanism by which you're acquiring the images. It's about what you're shooting. It's about what you're doing with them. It's about how you treat them.
It's hard to say because it's a hypothetical because we don't have him here and he hasn't been making films or creating a evolution in his own career up to this point. So it's really hard to say. But I think there was that Alan Heim actually mentioned something at one point that he wanted sort of like little fake film blips or like scratches put in the film and stuff like that. And then he decided that was too fake. Even at that time, it felt like it was too fake for him. He seems to want the actual grit and grime, or at that time, that's what he wanted. So when you watch something like Fosse Verdon and you see his actual techniques, or, cutting techniques, or shot angles or whatever put into that, it feels so different because it's not Bob Fosse doing that. It's not that it's bad. It's not that it's bad. It just is interesting to see that contrast.
In 2012, this is going back to Alan Heim, in 2012, the Editors Guild in Los Angeles here, asked its entire membership what they thought the best edited films of all time are. And they came up with a top 75. I don't know why they didn't come up with a top 100. I guess being editors, they wanted it to be about 3/4 the length that anybody else wanted it. So our film, All That Jazz, number 4 of the top 75 best edited films of all time, according to editors, only behind Apocalypse Now, number 3, number 2, Citizen Kane, and can you guys guess number 1? Raging Bull. And numbers 5 through 10, just FYI, Bonnie and Clyde, The Godfather, Lawrence of Arabia, Jaws, JFK, I question that one. And I like that movie, but best edited ever, I don't know. French Connection, number 10.
That's really interesting.
But it changed the game. I mean, this is a movie that legitimately, which is why I'm so glad that we're talking about it. It's not just, one of the greatest films ever. It's it literally changed the game. Even though the editing style, they came up with was kind of their trial run was Lenny, because it was baked into the script, because that was what they came to the plate with. This was the original plan. It seems so much more cohesive, so much more intentional. And it really changed the way a lot of movies not only were cut, but how a lot of people viewed movies, certainly musicals or anything kind of about, making movies or making theater.
Now, there was one article I read that was saying that the fractured timeline style of Lenny was actually written into the screenplay, which counters what Heim has said.
I mean, you can go back to Point Blank and French New Wave cinema, to go to discontinuous kind of experiential or experimental editing narratives. But it's because Point Blank is John Borman's Point Blank is a masterpiece. My God, that movie is amazing. You watch that movie, that movie's 30 years ahead of its time. It's amazing. But this movie, it's an experience. It's the way it's cut is so engrossing and so enveloping, and the runtime is at 2 hours. It's just over 2 hours, a minute over 2 hours is 121 minutes, and it feels the best 7-course meal of cinema you could possibly have.
With Fosse Verdon, though, what I found interesting about it was I think it really played on this idea of the symbiosis of themselves, and it kind of presents them as sort of a two-headed beast. They were kind of so reliant on each other once they came into each other's worlds. It was also interesting the way that it presented how the women in his life weren't just muses, if you wanted to call it that, but actually gave him the introduction or furthered his career in some way. It kind of made a point of Jo McCracken, his first wife. She was much more famous than him. definitely more famous than him at that time. And the same with Gwen Verdon. Like early in the relationship, she was a star. Nobody knew who Bob Fosse was. And then also, obviously, in terms of this two-headed beast, Gwen Verdon was instrumental in the creation of his work. Some might say just as important. The same thing played out in All That Jazz as that what played out in Fosse Verdon, which was a lot of the time, and I think this is something that's common with creatives and can be scary but completely common, which is I don't know what to do with something. And often Fosse was presented with that question for himself. I don't know what to do with this. Like when he's given a crap song in All That Jazz, the Take Off With Us song, that he then turns into this sexual orgy, this amazing sequence. Initially, he didn't know what to do with it, you know. And in Fosse Verdon, it shows that every time he didn't know what he was going to do, he turned to Gwen Verdon.
But he does that in All That Jazz, too. He did that in All That Jazz. He comes in and Leland Palmer's character is just like reminding him how he didn't remember the name of his girlfriend in Philadelphia, the weather girl or whatever. And it's like, you know, what was her name? Dorothy? What? Oh, yeah, darling, sweetheart, honey. Like, was it Dorothy? I forget what the actual name was. I'm just blipping out. But it was because that's what gives him the idea to do this, like, oh, I'm going to do a number about, like, how meaningless sex leads you to oblivion. And it's like one of the best, you know. And for further information, you can go to YouTube and look up Paula Abdul's Cold Hearted video, which literally rips off the entire erotica sequence. And it's a cool song, and I won't sing it now, but I'd like to.
There's an amazing line in Fosse Verdon as well where he says, I think I was trying to think of the point in the series where he says it, but it's, what's the difference between sex and applause? You only applaud someone you love.
That's when he's really riffing on the Lenny character and is actually doing stand-up in black and white at one point.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So it was him, doing the stand-up on stage, the pretend stand-up or the mind's eye stand-up. But that was sort of, you know, it encapsulates it so well, you know, just his whole life in this idea that, that's why people go into showbiz, you know, because they stand up there, they get applause, and they know people love them for that artifice, whatever that artifice is that they're presenting, their showbiz personality. And it's incredibly addictive. And that's what and I think Fosse Verdon managed to present that really, really, really well. It had, though, that symbiotic nature of it, though. There was a number of scenes, heaps of them throughout the film, where if you looked at it, you could almost see the Verdon-Fosse dialogue as being an inner dialogue, like one person's inner dialogue. One moment was when he was having the heart attack and the doctor's they're squabbling between each other, and the doctor says, hang on, you're having a heart attack, as he's, you know, as they're arguing with each other. And also just even the way that, you know, you look at, I mean, it was the title of this is Fosse / Verdon, basically almost one word, and that the Verdon-Fosse legacy, which has Verdon first, is actually written as one word. There's a lot of symbiosis between them. They're just, even the way that his life ended with him basically dying in her arms, dying of a heart attack, you know, being this thing that he was fearful of, but also, you know, this mind-body connection, this idea of, you know, he puts his heart into everything. And then you know, she was there at that moment of his death when he's going to the opening of the revival of Sweet Charity. I mean, you can't write that shit. You know, it's crazy.
All right, guys, we're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a film about trickery and fraud, about lies.
You don't talk about Napoleon or Julius Caesar. You're talking about Elmire.
Elmire?
Elmire?
Who is Elmire? That question has yet to be answered with any real precision.
Can I kiss you too? Anybody want to eat?
In the world of the jet setters among us beautiful people, everybody knows Elmire. But Elmire what?
He has about 60 times the same name.
Dihori?
His called his name Ori, Uri, Bori, Suri, Kori, Bari, Dori, all the...
Papa.
With U-R-Y, 60 names.
His real name was Elmire Ferenc Huffman.
Then 60 personalities, as much lies and as much real.
Well, sounds very Jesuitic.
Yes, his world is a world of make-believe.
I'm not an actor.
Not an actor? Elmire?
I'm not an actor. I am not a professional actor.
He's a leading actor in this movie. His profession, it's true, is painting fakes. Among all fakers, Elmire is number 2.
Once, I saw a man from Ibiza writing a book on fake who came to see me to Paris. He said, I heard you are the first man who bought an Elmire.
And that man's name was...
Clifford Irving.
The important distinction to make when you're talking about the genuine quality of a painting is not so much whether it's a real painting or a fake. It's whether it's a good fake or a bad fake.
That's right. We'll be back next week with a look at Orson Welles' F for Fake. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Emma and David. So, David, what's going on with you lately?
Way too much, but really good stuff. I have my own podcast for Outfest, which is the organization in Los Angeles that runs the LA Gay and Lesbian Film Festival called Outfest, but they do a lot of other things. And they started their first ever podcast and they asked me to do it. So we're in the middle of season 1. We're almost done recording everything. Thank you. I know it's a big deal. We're almost done recording everything. There are like several, more than half the episodes are up right now, but the people I talk to are, you know, folks like John Cameron Mitchell, Christine Vachon, Justin Simeon, who did Dear White People. Who else? Jim Fall and Miss Coco Peru talking about Trick 20 years later, which is a great movie, by the way. You should watch that. Jonathan Groff, documentarian Jeffrey Schwartz, filmmaker H.P. Mendoza. So it's awesome, and you can get it on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get podcasts. It's called The Outcasts, presented by Outfest. I think there are a few other Outcasts on there, but it's like, this is The Outcast presented by Outfest. So I'm doing that. I am editing a documentary for the Shudder Network about queer horror, which I'm very excited about. It's going to be really cool, and that's going to come out in 2021. I'm also working on my own documentary still over the years, which is called Heretics, which is about Exorcist II, the Heretic, and how it was shot and its ongoing legacy as one of the most misunderstood movies and demonized and despised movies in Hollywood history. It was a huge budget movie for Warner Brothers in 1977 and has become either forgotten or a punchline. And yet it is the movie in the middle of John Borman's body of work, which irrevocably changed him and led him to direct movies like Excalibur and The Emerald Forest and Hope and Glory and The General. Without Exorcist II, the Heretic and the stuff he learned on that, he would not have made those movies like that. And I had the very fortunate opportunity to talk to Borman, and I got him on camera, and I've talked to Linda Blair and Louise Fletcher and a bunch of other people who are still with us. And I cannot wait to finish this movie, but everything else has to calm down first. So that's going to come out in 2021 as well. But if you want to hear me now, if you thought I was interesting, go to Spotify or iTunes and look up The Outcast presented by Outfest. Or you can find me on Twitter, David Kittredge, Kittredge, or Instagram. I'm also on Facebook from time to time. I'd love to connect.
And Emma, what's new in your world?
I'm stuck in book world at the moment. So I'm very insular, which is appropriate while we're going through a global pandemic at the moment. But I've just delivered actually at the start of the year, delivered a book which is I co-wrote with a UK author called Jez Connolly, and it's another monograph. I've already written a monograph on The Fly, David Cronenberg's The Fly. And this monograph is on Seconds, John Frankenheimer's Seconds from 1966. Yeah, fantastic film. So good! And very exciting. It was really exciting doing the co-writing as well. I've never actually co-written a book, and I found it to be really joyous, exciting experience. But Jez is just a beautiful mind, amazing author himself. So that was great. And so that's delivered. Basically, we're just waiting for it to be edited and hopefully come out next year. Then I'm also working on a book, which is actually a book of essays on the Bride of Frankenstein. So I'm editing that one, and I've got a whole bevy of contributors who are coming up with some exciting angles, and I'm going to see how I can put it together as a book when I get them, and that's another one that hopefully will come out next year. So that's pretty much my main stuff.
Well, thank you again, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth and Lee Gambin take over the world.
Bye-bye, life. Bye-bye, happiness. Hello, loneliness. I think I'm gonna die. I think I'm gonna die. Bye-bye, love. Bye-bye, sweet caress. Hello, emptiness. I feel like I could die. Bye-bye, your life, goodbye. Bye-bye, my life, goodbye. Bye-bye, your life, goodbye. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He's gonna die. I think he's gonna die. I think I'm gonna die. There goes his baby with someone new. He sure is blue. I sure am blue. 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 Hello, he's gonna die. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bye-bye, love. Bye-bye, sweet caress. Hello, emptiness. I feel like I could die. Bye-bye, my life, goodbye. Bye-bye, your life, goodbye. Bye-bye, my life, goodbye. I'm through with romance. I'm through with love. Oh, yeah. I'm through with counting the stars above. Forget the stars, and here's the reason that he's so free. Here's a loving baby. She's through with me.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.